we are here with the man himself, Stan Efferding.
Thanks, brother. Good to finally see you. It's been years.
Long time coming.
Yeah,
for sure.
Shooting videos on a vertical diet since far back as I can remember. Thank you very much.
Yeah, when did you first come out with it?
I can't even remember anymore. It's been 7, 8 years. I think it was when I launched the Iceland seminar up at Hafþór Bjornsson's gym in Iceland.
Yeah.
And I just got inundated with requests for more information. It's like, this is the program I do for my clients. And so I put it all, I actually created all of that based on all of my, it's kind of the culmination of everything I learned over the years, everything I want my clients to know.
Yeah.
Whether it's weight loss or weight gain or, any problems that they've had or any goals that they have, I put together everything in a document that I wanted them to be able to read to optimize. It's not just nutrition. It's, as you know, it's sleep and hydration and blood testing and training, of course, and a whole host of, I put it all in there to make sure that I wasn't just repeating myself over and over and that people had access to all the information. And it just kind of developed from there. Initially, it was, what was it, a 25, 30-page PDF.
Yeah.
And then as people asked me more questions, I kept expanding on it. Now it's 240 pages with, over 300 references to peer-reviewed research and articles and videos, and just to help people take a deeper dive if they need to. But it expands based on my interaction with my clients and whether it's athletes or dad bods and soccer moms. And even, as you're aware, the DMs that you get, I've had over 100,000 DMs I've responded to in the last 5 years, and I'm sure you're just as overwhelmed as I am with that. And I've always used that as an opportunity to find out what is my followers, what's of most interest to them. And I spend my time trying to answer those questions and put it in the ebook if it's important to enough people, and then listen to their feedback. And it just has evolved from there. I call it a living document now.
Right.
Every updated version gets provided for free to anybody who bought a previous version. And so now the 4.0 is going to be out here before Christmas. I'm completely done with it. I just got to get it posted.
Awesome, man. Yeah, just as a preface for those who don't know, if you expand my video description on any YouTube video, I don't know how long it's been there now, but for years at this point, I've had my recommended diet essentially, and the vertical diet is Stan's culmination of knowledge, experience, both as a high-level coach for professional athletes, but also you have this unique hybrid kind of approach to taking actual literature and the science-based community on the cutting edge, staying on top of everything that's coming out and intertwining it with your actual real world experience. And it was always what I saw as, this is the thing to get started with if you don't know where to begin, or even as an intermediate, how do you dial things in for performance, muscle growth, but also hitting micronutrients at the same time. Like, I don't think I've ever seen, and this was years ago, maybe now it's different, but at the time it was actually like pretty revolutionary to focus on things that weren't just protein, carbs, and fats.
Right.
So that was something that I found is super valuable, and is why I've been essentially endorsing it for years. So I would definitely recommend you guys check it out if you haven't. Like you said, living document. So it's always updated with what he believes is the most cutting edge of information. But I would love to, before we get granular on all the stuff that has gone into it, the changes over the years, just kind of going back to the beginning, because I don't really know a lot about history-wise before you were, professional bodybuilder, powerlifter, etc. Like, I don't know how you got into this industry and what interested you so highly about it, and kind of how you, went from adolescence to getting into this industry.
Yeah. Well, some of this is interesting because it kind of falls into a lot of the stuff that you've been doing over the years. But I was a skinny kid beyond skinny kid. I wrestled 98 pounds as a freshman and sophomore in high school, which, by the way, my 9-year-old son is 130 pounds already. So I was a skinny kid. I was 106 as a junior, 115 as a senior.
And was it just like so much activity and not enough eating and no focus on eating, or what was the main?
And of interest, delayed onset puberty as a result of inadequate sleep. I was working a swing shift till midnight, getting home at 1 or later in the morning, waking up at 6:30 or so a.m. I was eating crap food I was working at 7-Eleven. And so it was the nacho pump cheese and the fountain sodas, and it was just hot dogs if that. So I had a horrendous diet. Didn't eat enough. Was very active. I suffered from a lot of episodes of hypoglycemia throughout that period. I remember getting dizzy spells quite often. I was so active, obviously in wrestling and the like, and just not eating enough food, not sleeping enough. And I thought, there was something wrong with me, of course, at the time. And now we just understand what that is. Going hypo is not all that uncommon with inadequate calories or carbohydrates for active individuals. And at the time, I didn't know. It was just a late onset puberty as a result of not having enough sleep or calories. And so I speak a lot about that to kids. I worked with a lot of high school, collegiate, and professional athletes over the years. And, I'm not a big fan of the weight cutting for wrestling for those very reasons. I think you can delay, if not completely inhibit growth at that age. And it's something that I'm very cautious about. And with women, too, in terms of the female triad, the cessation of the menstrual period and the anemia and hypothyroidism and all those things that they realized, and which I started to see more of and more of as I started to train female bodybuilder figure physique bikini competitors. But I finally got to my senior year. I went out to Pennsylvania and lived with my uncle, and he owned a farm, and so we had whole milk from the dairy farm next door. We would go get the kind where you had to shake it up because there was 4 inches of cream on top, and we would eat steak and bacon, just a lot more food. And so I finally went through a small growth phase at that time, just from having enough food and sleeping well and still working hard on the farm. But I'd only managed to get up to about 135 pounds as an 18-year-old freshman in college. And so I was still quite small.
Question about that period of time. Like, obviously it is the period where the highest velocity of maturation occurs, and having sufficient nutrients to support that growth for height, bone infrastructure, muscle, etc., all, critical. But what I think a lot of people don't think about is that something that, let's just say you didn't take it seriously enough in adolescence, can you make up for that in adulthood, or do you lose some permanent growth potential if you're not relatively dialed through that period?
I think it's really individualistic. I think you can continue to grow, and some evidence of that will come as I continue on this story, this chronology. 140-pound freshman in college, 18 years old, 135, right in there. Started lifting weights. I wanted to be a pro bodybuilder, of all things. We were in the gym with all the guys from the fraternity, and 135 was on the bar to warm up. Of course, always, just one plate on each side. Everybody went through and they knocked out their reps, and of course I got under it. I couldn't do a single rep at 135. I am as a freshman in college, and I still remember having to take the 35 or the 45s off, putting the 35s on just so I could get a rep or two.
Traumatic experience.
Yes, as you can see, I'm still troubled about it. 10 years later, I was benching nearly 600, but we'll get there. And I saw the magazines, and back then it was a lot of the amateurs, because there was only, I think, 2 pro cards a year. Well, one at the Nationals for the overall champion, or one at the USA's for the overall champion, and one for each weight class at Nationals, which I think there was only 4 or 5 weight classes. Heavyweight was everything over 198. And so you had this huge group of top national guys training out of Gold's Venice, and that were not pros yet. But by the time they won a pro card, they were placing top 5 in the Olympia that year or the year after. But those are the magazines, and I wanted to be a pro bodybuilder, 135-pound, 18-year-old. And so I got Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. I enrolled into a weightlifting course at the University of Oregon, of course, with my other things that I was interested in at the time. And I started eating the same diet as the guy behind the counter at the Gold's Gym who was competing in a show. So that was tuna fish and rice cakes, right? That was all my knowledge at the time. We just didn't have the benefit of all the information that's available today, of course. And so, and then I would go into the science library and I would start scrolling through microfiche, which your young audience might not recognize, but it's somewhat akin to your grandfather's 8-track tape player in his old pickup truck. And they would sit there and scroll through microfiche to read research to see what was relevant to me as a bodybuilder in terms of nutrition or supplementation at the time. After 2 years of training, I was only 154 pounds in my first bodybuilding show in 1988. And I'm talking about lifting, every single day, 6 days a week, probably overtraining and undereating until I came across a local gym owner, competitor and promoter of shows. And he said, you got to flip the script. You're training too much and eating too little. So he told me, you're not allowed to go to the gym, but for every other day instead of every day.
Right.
And you got to dramatically increase your calories. And I still didn't have much growth until finally when I was 20 years old, I was so frustrated, I went into a doctor and I got a blood test and found out that I was hypogonadal as a result of varicocele.
So hypogonadal, just for the audience, even though they probably know, but
Yeah.
how would you define?
145, I think, was the testosterone level at the time. And
So it's like anything under the reference range, essentially?
yeah. And that was, for me, it was because of varicocele, which is not, doesn't always result in, hypogonadism, but for a large percentage of those are, and that varicocele is a vein that doesn't drain from the testicular area, so it accumulates heat and restricts blood flow, and so you just don't have the sperm production, or the testosterone production can be suppressed.
Yeah, I would love to flesh that out a little bit more too, because I think a lot of people, when they get on hormones, especially HRT too, they see a transient snapshot in time in their blood work. It shows, oh, I'm at 224 total tests. I must need TRT. And upstream, it doesn't seem to be anything wrong for my pituitary output, but not factoring in structural abnormalities at the actual organ affecting output quite significantly. And because I think a lot of people will think, if there's nothing wrong from a signaling standpoint, my testicle response must just be suboptimal. So of course I need TRT forever. Like, this is primary hypogonadism, but maybe not the case. This is a interesting oversight, I think, in the HRT space a little bit.
Yeah.
How would you go about, I don't know, like, did you have any pain, or like, how did you figure
Yeah,
this?
you do. You have pain associated with that, just like an ache, an aching sensation, real uncomfortable, as you might presume. Sometimes worse than others, depending on your activity level. And so, but I wasn't in the position to afford surgery at the time, nor did I know much about it. It was well over 10 years later before I actually got the surgery. But I went on TRT at the time with the doctor that I had seen, and that was, one shot a test a week is what it was, which was 200 milligrams a week, which by today's standards is pretty good.
That's a while ago too. I'm kind of interested that you
ago.
were able to get that.
Yeah, and I started to see pretty significant results from that, and then of course I kind of went off script there with the doc as things started to get better and better, and bumped up the dose over the years, and so I was. That's how I started to. When I really started to see results is when I was when I was completely my testosterone was sufficient, and the calories and the training was all sufficient. But I was on a podcast recently, and I think it was Vigorous Steve, and I was talking about what we believed was a lot in the 1990s, in the early 90s. And we went on to talk about, the dosages that I used in 2008 through 14 when I came back to competing. But in those early years, we thought 2 cc's of Assertion was a lot of testosterone, 500 milligrams a week. And then if you added like 20 milligrams of D-ball on top of that, that was, you were killing it. I got up to almost 300 pounds. Over that by 1994 on that protocol, never going over 2 cc's a test a week. One, availability, two, cost for a college student, et cetera, and got really strong. I pulled 782 in competition with no belt back in 1994, I believe, on 2 cc's of Sustanon and 20 milligrams of D-ball. And the only reason I mention that is because obviously in later years, 2009 through 14, I used considerably more to reach, to set those world records. But in looking back, in reflecting back, because a lot of OGs at the time that I knew were like, oh, if you're not going to grow into this, I would ask about growth hormone, insulin. I wanted to know about all that back in the early 90s. And most of the old Gs that I talked to back then that were huge guys, were like, if you're not going to grow in test and T-ball, you're not going to grow.
Yeah.
And somehow I managed to forget that when I got to later on in years and world records were on the line. And so things changed for me then. But I always talk about that. Sometimes people confuse side effects with effects.
Oh, for sure, with T-ball especially.
Yeah. But I never had an experience where I gained like 30 pounds in a month. I was always a slow gainer, even when I got on testosterone. It took me, many years, but it was very consistent. That's all. I would eat, sleep, and train over and over and over again. But with that protocol, I was able to achieve, a significant amount of weight and strength and size But I didn't. I trained with guys who were better than me.
Yeah.
I trained with stronger guys. I trained with bigger guys. I trained with Aaron Madron, who at the time who became one of the great IFBB pros, was on the cover of magazines, was fantastic. And at some point back in 1997, a couple things happened. One is I looked at Aaron, I looked at me as we were posing in front of the mirror, and I realized there's a big difference here, you know, between a guy who's shaking his tricep and is flapping like this, and his calves are like 21 inches, and, you know, quads were like 34. And I was like, you know, something's not right about this. And
yeah, it might sound like an absurd question, but how would you determine if somebody is genetically blessed enough to even have it be worth subjecting yourself to this kind of hormone exposure? Because it's like, obviously, at some level, people will always say, you'd be stupid to take stuff unless you're competing or unless you're a professional athlete. And then it's like, well, how do I even determine that I have the genetics that should dictate the justification of that?
Well, you'd be stupid to take a lot of stuff at the compromise of your health, which, of course, back then we didn't do very much blood testing. Now, you know, of course, it's much more available and much more affordable. And I think the wise ones do it, not just for health, but also for performance, because there's things you can do to optimize your performance with those blood tests. But back then, you know, Aaron was one of those kids. When he was 18, he had 20-inch arms. You look at guys like Jay Cutler. Wasn't he teen national champion when he was 18, 19 years old? I think he said he weighed about the same at 19 as he did at 30 when he was winning the Olympia. Obviously, there was a transformation in terms of lean muscle tissue, but these are big guys. I mean, the same would be true of, say, Branch Warren. Didn't he win teen nationals when he was 18 years old?
I think he came like short, just second place to Jay. I think that was the only time he lost. There's, as we know, genetics reign supreme, and part of genetics can be how responsive you are to performance-enhancing drugs. It's interesting though, because you mentioned how you weren't like a fast gainer when you took it. You didn't notice a big bump of 30 pounds quickly. So it's like, how would you have determined if you were to suggest, or I don't know, oversee yourself back then, your response was good enough to actually justify shooting for a pro card? Yeah.
Well, at the time, you know, when you're 6 foot, you needed to be 250 on stage. We didn't have the men's classic bodybuilding or you know, the men's the mankini. What is that? The men's
physique. Yeah.
We didn't have that. I wish we did, because I've never had great legs. The board shorts would have been to my advantage. But that was your only option.
Yeah.
You know, when you're 150 pounds and you want to be a pro bodybuilder at 6 foot, you got to be 250. And so all bets are off until you get there.
Yeah.
You know, you just have to be big enough. But some people respond much better than others. And we saw that there were many bodybuilders who you would see in the off season would lose 40, 50 pounds. The names are escaping me now. Paul Dillette was one.
Kevin Leveroni.
But
like, obviously he admittedly would come off of everything seemingly purposefully like melt himself.
Yeah, and we learned lessons about that, about lasting and cruising, and a lot of people thought they had to clean out their receptors and this, that, and the other, but they just end up losing a ton of muscle. But when they would go back on, they would just explode in growth.
Yeah, what do you think because this is a highly debated topic in professional bodybuilding, is a lot of times these guys will clean out for a month or two, but in reality, they are just clearing long esters out of their system to almost get to a point of lack of suppression. Your blood work looks transiently a little bit better from an HDL standpoint because it's not being suppressed by the exogenous androgens. Stuff looks a bit nicer, but you've essentially crashed yourself just to be able to say, I came off, just to jump back on again. Like, what do you think that does from like a heart stress standpoint, organ stress, having that massive fluctuation in water weight constantly? Like, do you think just staying on a baseline of TRT, if you're in that industry at a professional level, is probably a more reasonable strategy, or what is your thought on that?
Well, I think we know that from the research suggests that hypogonadal men have increased mortality risk for a host of reasons. And so in terms of retaining lean mass, doesn't make any sense to go completely off, particularly because a lot of those PCT protocols just, for a lot of people, for most people, just don't bring your testosterone, your normal levels up high enough or quickly enough. You know, in that short, you know, what would be 8, 12 weeks that you're off before you get on again. So I think I think the Blast and Cruise would have been a lot better plan back then. I would go off back then because I didn't know any better, and we didn't have access to HCG.
So when you said off, though, you originally had to get on TRT because of a varicocele. Are you saying like actually off, or like to
for the same reason? I used to think that you'd have to clean out your receptor sites. Right. I would go off and then go back on, and I just found that I would lose a significant amount of muscle and strength, and so eventually you end up learning from personal experience as opposed to what we know now in terms of the inability of your system to rebound.
And was the surgery successful, by the way? I should have asked in terms.
Yeah, it was successful. It does come back. Mine not as significantly as previously, and sometimes it kind of depends individually on how many years until it comes back, but it can recur either through the same vein or a different one.
Okay.
So that I don't want to leave people to think that it's a permanent fix, but it's relatively it's a quick in and out procedure with an easy recovery. It's not bad. And so,
do you know what the literature shows on people who are hypogonadal as a result of that getting the surgery? Like in general, how many people are able to restore relatively natural function just from the surgery?
Not aware.
Okay.
No, don't know.
Anecdotally, have you heard of like people who've had it as well? Or?
Yeah, I haven't, because by that time, after 10 years of
it's kind of irrelevant for
you end up and because you're trying to compete, of course, then you're really not focused on what your natural system can do. But that was, it's kind of a long story that I wanted to include, recognizing that adolescents can be pretty significantly adversely affected by insufficient sleep and calories, mainly, certainly protein. Particularly in those weight-cutting sports for wrestlers and those distance sports for female athletes, that's a big deal. And then getting blood tests, at even a young age. I was working with a women's softball team, high school women's softball team, a couple summers ago in Arizona, and we were doing some laser-timed 40s just as a test to see how their performance was. And two of the girls on the team had significantly declined in their 40 time. And so we asked the parents, what's going on? Oh, she's been really tired. She's been stressed, blah, blah, blah. And I said, can we get a blood test? Got a blood test. Both of them had anemia, which is going to have a huge effect on performance.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from, some of that comes from overtraining, but these girls in softball aren't, these aren't distance runners. It came from over-restriction of their diet. They had started demonizing a whole host of foods based on what they gleaned from social media. And of course, being in that, that body culture in high school, with the body image, and next thing you know, they were cutting out red meat, they were cutting out dairy, they were cutting out fruit, they were cutting out the egg yolks, they weren't salting their foods.
Yeah.
And these are girls who are, training, and they do, even softball players train a lot harder these days in high school than they used to when I was growing up. You just kind of played the game. And now they actually have strength and conditioning coaches, and they're doing sprinting, and they're doing distance work, and so they were both anemic, and so we had to implement a protocol. Very quickly bounced back and recovered their performance. But it's just an example of how bad nutrition information. The same thing that I talked about in the Vertical Diet ebook, from my experience with bodybuilding, figure physique, bikini training women for competition, going all the way back to the early 90s. I was training women up to and including the professional level way back then, and would see very commonly all of those same problems with that pre-contest and the hypothyroidism, the hair loss, the depression, all of those things. And then the rebound afterwards, the extraordinary fat accumulation, edema, the water retention to the point where it was painful. They had to go to a doctor and get diuretics, that kind of thing. And so I had seen that so much. And of course, I've been on both sides of that throughout my own personal career. I've dieted down to single-digit body fat many, many, many times to compete up to the pro level. And then I've also bulked up to 300 pounds many times throughout my career. And I would go back and forth. I'd bulk up to 300 pounds and then power lift, and I would diet down to single-digit body fat to bodybuild. And then I would go back and forth and back and forth. Learn a lot of lessons along the way, one of which is the extreme dieting, how much muscle you lose, and then, of course, the dirty bulks, how much fat you gain, and what an adverse effect that has on metabolic syndrome and all of your blood markers and stuff. So that's why when we talk about the vertical diet, it's not any one thing. it depends on the individual's goals, and I make obviously very different recommendations for those individuals.
Yeah.
And then, Gen Pop is kind of a split between the two.
Quick interruption to bring you a note from Marek Health, my preventative medicine and hormone replacement therapy platform. This is a very cool integration in particular for this episode, because Stan is actually the guy who I learned a lot of this stuff from initially years ago. If you go as far back as 2018 on my channel, you can see Vertical Diet Log Introduction / Overview of Goals. And in that video, I describe how my goals of doing the vertical diet are upregulate thyroid function, enhance cognitive function, optimize gut health, hit all micronutrient needs. And at the time, I was driving over the border, going to a LabCorp in Blaine, Washington, and the person whose panel I was ordering, I was getting, through Stan Efferding. And it's pretty cool because now Marek Health offers his panel for a fraction of the cost. I think it's like less than half the price. And he promotes it on our behalf, which is fucking incredible. Like, for somebody who is so highly regarded in this industry with such a wealth of knowledge, and somebody who I have learned from so much myself, and following their principles and their recommendations and whatnot, and literally ordering the panel at that time was like the most cost-effective one, and now being able to do it now for less than half the price, pretty fucking cool. And just the fact that he talks about us in general, it's awesome. He refers his athletes there, he uses us himself. It's just a really, really awesome full circle moment for me personally. So anyways, as far as the offering, the link in the description below will take you to my landing page where you can get the exact blood test that I get when I'm in the States. This is a service that is in general going to be most convenient if you are a US citizen, all but if you're traveling from out of country like myself, you can also coordinate it. But in general, if you're going to get seen by a medical professional, it should be US citizens. And the complete package is what is on my landing page. 34 tests with over 100 biomarkers, and it includes a lab review. So back in the day when I'd get a panel, I would basically get a sheet with a bunch of numbers, results, and it would show if I was in the reference range or not, and that was the extent of it. I would then be tasked with interpreting it and deciphering it myself, or bringing it to a doctor and trying to get some actionable information from that, which often was not met with great feedback. Like the local docs, at least here for the family physicians, were not thrilled with me even getting blood work, let alone try to help me interpret it. So that's kind of what led to the inception of Marek Health to begin with, is being able to take control of your health and be preventative, as well as to optimize performance, which is what Stan is a pioneer of. Back, as long as he's been posting, very few people were talking 5+ years ago about how to use diagnostic metrics, biomarkers to optimize health preventatively, enhance vitality, but also optimize performance in sports as well as in the gym, for hypertrophy or strength or whatever your main priorities are. Like, it's a full comprehensive suite of unaddressed factors in the fitness industry that Stan was at the forefront of. Again, just badass that he's working with us. So you can check it out. Link in the description below. Use code MPMD to save 10% off. This is, again, like I said, the panel that I get personally. It's insanely comprehensive, so you certainly don't need to get this one in particular unless you want to be as thorough as me. This is designed for athletes and those who are simply seeking peak performance, vitality, with the most elaborate blood testing available in the market, with the most cutting edge biomarkers available. Our providers and clinical team are always on top of the most new literature to stay up to date on what we should be tweaking and modifying to give the most comprehensive insight into your whole body health, performance, etc. status. So you can check that out, but also if you want a more cost-effective option, feel free to go to marekhealth.com and check out our self-service labs builder, where you can add your own biomarkers to a cart separately and build your own panel from scratch, or you can use some of the other pre-vetted panels that we have at different budget offerings. All but, again, if you want the most comprehensive one, this is the one that's linked in the description. It's the one I use personally. So you can check it out if you want to get as much insight as possible into whole body systemic health and resilience, including but not limited to micronutrient status, oxidative stress, clotting factors, tumor markers, metabolic function, the works. So you can check it out. All your support is much appreciated, by the way. It's been an amazing journey so far with this company. So you guys are largely to thank for that as well. So anyways, back to the regularly scheduled programming.
Kind of an interesting bro science question, but those bulks and cuts, one thing that I see as prominent, but I don't think there's any literature to prove it, is between the bulk and cut phase, often there is this marination period that bodybuilders speak to, where you kind of sustain and hold to kind of adapt your kind of metabolic state to this amount of tissue before you dive into a deficit and start stripping fat off. Do you feel that in practice that is more conducive to holding a new set point of mass, or do you think that you can just go right from bulk to cut to bulk to cut?
You know, I haven't seen that. I think what generally happens is, and I can't speak scientifically, like you said, it's a bro science question.
Sure.
But what generally I see happens is that when people bulk, they put on more fat than they thought. You know, they think they're getting more muscular, but they're probably putting on more fat. And then I would like to hold that weight for a while to make that become your new set point. Because here's what I found is that obviously as you increase calories, your metabolism increases. As you decrease calories, your metabolism decreases. It's metabolic adaptation, and it's common and it's expected as you get larger and smaller to have a higher or lower BMI. But what I found is particularly common now with a lot of the influencers on social media, is that they kind of want to have a six-pack year-round. And so if they do a little mini bulk or something and they end up with a four-pack, then they get scared and then they immediately start dieting back down. And they just don't seem to retain the lean mass that they worked hard for. And a lot of dieting, my experience historically, and I think we see that now, if you try and do either too fast, if you try and bulk too quickly or diet too quickly, you're going to gain too much fat in the bulk and you're going to lose too much muscle in the diet.
Yep.
And especially if you don't, like now, athletes will take at least, I want to say 16 to 24 weeks to diet correctly for a show, to try and hold on to as much lean mass as possible. And we used to, 12 was a long diet. Yeah. 10 was pretty common. Yeah. And we would drop 1,000 calories and get on that treadmill for 40 minutes twice a day. Yeah. And you'd lose a lot of size. A lot of size. And so I would start speaking out against that, of course, because as a skinny kid, myself in particular, I would just thin out if I tried to do too much cardio and too much caloric restriction. Plus, we used to do the higher rep stuff too. Right. That was always the thing.
You like spot
toned.
Right. High reps for toning. That was a classic.
And we forgot to keep the heavy weights in, and I don't know if I mean heavy so much as the intensity, getting to within a rep or two of failure. We didn't provide a sufficient stimulus to hold on to lean mass.
Right.
And so I don't do any of that with my clients now. I try and find out how strong they are. And I worked with Nadia White, who took third in the Miss Olympia, and we had her eating steak all the way up to the show, and a whole egg and yogurt and fruit and all those things. And obviously we created a calorie deficit for her, but we wanted to keep sufficient substrates in there for her, so she wasn't having any of those previously any of those micronutrient deficiencies that she would experience. But we cut out cardio, but for 10-minute walks after each of 4 meals daily. That's all the cardio that she did. Yeah. But we had her train twice a day, and we focused on her weight, the load that she was lifting. She loved to lift heavy weights, and so if she could do, if she could squat 225 for 8. I wanted to try and hold that as long as I could. Now, I might not be able to get her to do 4 sets of that. As your weight drops and your carbohydrates drop, you're not going to have as much endurance for that kind of volume or frequency, but you can potentially try and maintain the intensity. So maybe she's only doing 2 sets there every 8 days, as opposed to 4 sets there every 3 days.
Right.
So that's the goal.
Okay.
I didn't mean 2 sets there twice every 8 days.
Yeah.
Instead of training, every 72 hours is what we had on a schedule initially.
You mentioned a lot of guys nowadays will bulk up until they almost don't see abs, and then they freak out, and then they cut back down. They don't really make any real progress. Is there some sort of ceiling that you use as a metric for this is where you need to reel it back? Because it's like, there are many things you could point to, like you look bad in the mirror, or you could look to actual body composition metrics via a DEXA or something, or you could look to insulin resistance markers via blood work or an array of different things. Like, what do you use as a coach?
You're hitting all the nails on the head. Now, if it's a bodybuilder athlete, I don't want to accumulate too much body fat. It's just, they're just going to have to take it off, and it's going to be a longer diet for the show. And so I want to be a little more conservative. And I think whether you're at a 300 calorie surplus or 1,000 calorie surplus for an experienced lifter, you're probably not going to gain any more additional muscle with the extra surplus. You probably just, that'll probably be fat that you'll accumulate. So a small surplus for an experienced lifter, and if you're competing in bodybuilding, then you're an experienced lifter. And that would be 300 to 500 calories. And I would watch the body fat. Different athletes are different. With me, I can increase my calories 500. And that might only cost me to gain weight for a week or two before my body increases its metabolism 500, because I have a fast metabolism. And so I have to keep, that was always my challenge, was eating enough to stay in a surplus, continuously. I had to keep increasing calories. I couldn't just increase calories and leave them there. And that happens with some folks, and some folks are easier gainers and easier fat gainers too. But I don't want to put on too much fat on a bodybuilder. And so if they get north of 15%, I think we're pretty good, and I can use whether it's a DEXA or just a mirror, as soon as you start losing those bottom two abs. But now you're talking about something that's really important, because I've worked with a lot of world's strongest men competitors and NFL football players and strongmen, and they don't want to lose weight. Their goal isn't to bodybuilder. They want to have as much strength as possible, and they need sufficient mass to, mass moves mass. Lane Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles was one. When I started working with him, he was about 312 pounds. He felt like he needed to be over 330. He's 6'7", in order to compete and stay healthy. And there's something to be said for that in terms of being too lean, and how Larry Wheels experienced that many times throughout his career, trying to lift heavy really lean and get more susceptible to injury. He started pulling and tearing muscles. Hafþór and I talked to him numerous times about, if you're going to try and strongman, you're going to need to be 290, 300, just to save your joints and your muscles from tearing. Well, we got Lane up to 330 pounds and improved his blood pressure. It went from, it was 152 down to 131 by 20 points. Now, part of that was he had apnea, and we got him wearing his CPAP. He had one, but didn't wear it. It was uncomfortable, so we reprogrammed his settings and got him a new mask. But same with Hafþór. If you remember me telling the story years ago, he weighed about 440 pounds, and I brought him down to 396 initially, because we wanted to improve his health. All those markers, the liver, fatty liver being the primary driver of just about everything else. And that's what these guys that are permabulking, strongmen, powerlifters, and the like, they just tend to overeat constantly and stay heavy all year round. And so they end up accumulating a significant amount of liver fat, and there goes the blood pressure, there goes the triglycerides and the blood sugar and all of those things. And so we brought him down. All of that dramatically improved, as it does with weight loss on any diet. And now we have to take him back up to compete. But when we took him back up, we changed his diet such that we decreased the amount of fat that he was taking in. Fats, well, in particular saturated fats, I know this triggers a lot of folks, but we do see in the literature that the liver fat is accumulated at a faster rate on saturated fats than it is on monounsaturated fats. And the goal is
and that's when calories are equated as well.
That's when calories are equated. And if you're in a calorie surplus, you're going to want to have less saturated fat. So I always had a reasonably low fat diet. I've never recommended over 30% fat as a percentage of total calories.
So what's an example of what people are typically getting fat from, and then what you would deem as ideal, just like source-wise?
If you're a bulker, then typically it's cheeseburgers and fatty meats and pizzas and lots of butter on your bread and things like that, bacon, those things. Packed with calories, you can add a lot of weight with them. The problem is if you're a competitive athlete, or if you have a concern for your long-term health, that you're going to want to watch that liver fat accumulation, and you're going to want to watch, at the time we were looking at cholesterol as an overall metric, but now LDL then secondarily became kind of the most important metric, and now we have APOB, the actual particle that is the atherosclerotic particle that can lodge into the blood vessels and start that process. And so now we want to measure ApoB. Well, how does ApoB get increased? And we see now that saturated fat decreases the LDL receptors on the liver, which reduces cholesterol clearance from the bloodstream. So ApoB starts climbing. Mm-hmm. And I know people will start conflating cholesterol from diet with cholesterol in the bloodstream, and they're not the same thing.
Yep.
Dr. Tom Dayspring has gone over this in great detail, and many, many hours of great videos that he's posted. And it's important when I reference a particular individual and what they said to recognize that he is a domain-specific expert in that field, a 40-year researcher in lipidology. I'm not referencing a journalist. I'm not referencing an engineer. I'm not referencing a chiropractor. I'm referencing lipidologists. And he, just specifically with respect to cholesterol consumption from the diet, he mentioned that about only 20% of the population, hyperabsorbers, will convert or absorb, hyperabsorbers will absorb cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, into the bloodstream and increase ApoB because it's a esterified fat. So that's the reason why it's not cholesterol that you're concerned about necessarily, dietary cholesterol in terms of raising cholesterol. And saturated fat, its impact on the liver is what allows that cholesterol to keep recirculating and accumulating in the body without an opportunity to be drawn into the liver. Again, less receptor sites drawn into the liver and then excreted with the bile. And there's other things that impact that as well. And I'm not suggesting that ApoB is even the most important driver. I mean, it's necessary but not sufficient, as Peter T has said many times. The blood vessel, the things that break down the endothelial lining, high blood pressure, high blood sugars. High blood sugars is probably a greater risk factor for presuming ApoB is present in sufficient amounts. You see, if you're looking at risk factors, that's the reason why people focus on sugars so much, because you do have a significantly higher risk of cardiovascular disease with diabetes, presuming there's sufficient ApoB. But the ApoB is necessary. And so you can accelerate the risk with multiple, it's a multifactorial disease. You can accelerate the risk, of course, by being diabetic or having insulin resistance. And that same could be true of high iron. Same could be true of low estrogen. Estrogen also helps with clearance of cholesterol from the liver. And it helps with the endothelial lining and protecting it from its susceptibility to ApoB. I didn't mean to get into a deep dive with this. This is not my realm. This is obviously Peter T does a much better job than I do at this, and obviously Dr. Tom Dayspring. But I just want to make sure that, because there's a lot of...
No, this is the great thing about your stuff, is you'll take that and then bring it into the layman perspective for bodybuilding industry, where they would never go watch, the most intensive and literature-dense version of that topic. So this is what's so great about the vertical diet, in my opinion.
Well, and I set my world records at age 44 and 45. It's a pretty long career, and I maintained reasonable health with blood tests on almost a monthly basis. Obviously, I would see a decline in my health or my blood markers as I got heavier. And it was kind of, in retrospect, I think that's one of the things that led to my longer career, is that I would then bodybuild, and so I would bulk up, which it's hard to be healthy at an extreme weight like that. But then I would diet down, and we kind of opened this conversation talking about, does the dieting down help with your health? And of course it does. And so now I want my athletes, my big athletes, to periodize their weight, and I want them to take off some pounds, not try and stay heavy year round. You don't lift heavy year round. You shouldn't if you want to get stronger. Not maximal loads. Certainly, we definitely periodize our training. So I want to periodize their weight, and I want to use blood tests as a marker to be able to gauge. More recently, I started working with Mitchell Hooper, current world's strongest man. He's getting ready for the Arnold Classic, and that was one of the first things he said to me. He says, "Stan, I want to get bigger, but I don't want to get fat." And he's a smart guy, and he does blood tests, and so I just very frankly told him, if you want to get bigger and you want to increase your calories and you don't want to get fat, then here's the things that you got to watch out for. We got to make sure that you're getting sufficient soluble fibers in your diet, and you're not ODing on butter and bacon and fatty meats. I'm a big fan of red meat, but I use lean meats. I've always been a top sirloin guy. I've always been a 96.4 beef guy. And then dairy has always been huge for me. We see that the fat in dairy does not increase due to the type of fat that, what's that called? It's called the globulin, the fat membrane. It apparently does not elevate LDL as would, say, a butter that's been refined and you've lost that milk fat globulin membrane because of the refining process. Plus dairy, I think it was Stu Phillips was just talking about this recently, beyond the benefits of protein. The comparison was between dairy and whey. Beyond the benefits of protein, dairy seems to have additional muscle building and BMI effects, positive BMI effects.
It's weird because some people will point to leucine thresholds of certain stuff and then say like, oh, it's not as good as other, but then other literature will say otherwise. I think in general, dairy is excellent.
Yeah. Well, and then we see from the Sonnenberg trials with out of Stanford, I think Chris Gardner was a part of that study where they looked at dairy in terms of its microbiome benefits, diversity and density, and they found that a fermented food, yogurt was the one used, 100% of the people that were studied had an improvement, more diversity and density. And with the fiber intervention, this gets a lot of reason why a lot of people are complain about fiber. Only a third of them saw an increase in diversity and density, and a third had no change, and a third had actually declined diversity and density. They had adverse effects as a result of fiber intake. And of course, this caused a lot of people to start to say that vegetables are poison. We know who they are. Friends of mine in the industry, Paul Saladino. I've been on his podcast. I credit myself for getting him to switch from keto carnivore to adding fruits and yogurt.
Oh yeah, I used to make dismantlement videos of his blood work because I would see his sky high SHBG and low free test, and it was baffling to me that it wasn't occurring to these guys that perhaps carbohydrates are not the devil in all circumstances.
Right. And I'm the first to acknowledge, because I was the one introducing many years ago the FODMAP diet for people who had digestive distress, IBS in particular.
And kudos to him for not being so dogmatic that he leans into it at the detriment of his message, because he already wrote a book that was a physical copy that was very much
as did Mark Bell, War on Carbs. But Mark's tried a lot of things over the year, and I credit him for that, for at least trying and seeing what works best for him. But most of these folks, I was on Mike Mutzel's podcast years ago. He was devoutly keto carnivore, intermittent fast, maybe not totally carnivore, but he was keto intermittent fast for many years. And he started introducing carbohydrates around training for performance.
Yep.
Same thing that Paul Saladino has done, Peter Attia.
Yeah.
I've watched Peter for years.
Watching his transformation from the most extreme of fasting to eating enough to stimulate muscle protein synthesis multiple times per day around the clock and being... Yeah, it's interesting.
And I don't know when the light bulb went off on with him. And look, I've been in this business 35 years.
Yeah.
I'm a patient guy. You don't think I'd tried keto in the early 90s? I worked with Dave Palumbo. You don't think I tried keto in 2012?
Yeah.
It's not like I haven't been there before. I've seen it. But I'm a patient guy, and I watch guys like Peter Attia, that's a Mensa level genius.
Yeah.
A brilliant guy,
Yeah.
Stanford MD, Johns Hopkins oncology surgeon. The guy's just absolutely a genius mathematician. On top of all that, listening to him is fascinating. Listening to the biochemistry that these folks and the way they understand it. But they're not right about everything. And they've had they've evolved because his domain wasn't nutrition. But as he started interviewing more and more people about nutrition, people whose domain-specific expertise was PhD nutrition, he started to evolve. Originally, he was a big Gary Taubes guy, carbohydrate insulin model guy. He most famously was on the TED Talks talking about how sugar was killing everyone, and he missed the proper nuance in there that ultra-processed foods that are overconsumed are a combination of sugar and fat, and it's I think what we call now energy toxicity. And again, we're back to the liver. As soon as you exceed your fat thresholds, your personal fat storage capability, then those excess calories, carbs or fat, are going to start getting turned into, if they're carbohydrates, turned into triglycerides. If there's no storage for them, they're going to start accumulating in the liver. And that's when all sorts of bad things happen, as we mentioned earlier. But we watched Peter Dia, God bless him, piss on keto sticks for 3 years, and then do the intermittent fasting, the 7-day fasts, and I mean, more recently we saw Dana White come out and make some claims about 7-day fast will reduce your cancer risk by 70%.
Yeah, what do you think of Gary Brecka?
There's absolutely no evidence to that.
Have you seen some of his stuff?
Gary's all over the internet now, getting torn apart for a lot of the claims that he makes. Now, I will say this: Gary got Dana to lose weight.
Yep.
Hats off to Gary for that.
Yep.
I've gotten thousands of people to lose weight. Dr. Jason Fung, with his carbohydrate insulin model, which has long been debunked, gets thousands of people to lose weight.
Yeah.
Vegan people get thousands of people to lose weight. Carnivore people get thousands of people. We all have testimonials, all of us. Mm-hmm. They say, look at how many people we've helped. But it's not unique to that particular diet. The common underpinning to that is weight loss.
Yeah.
And we see it, as I've mentioned many times before, and people just lose their shit on the internet when I talk about the fact that the McDonald's diet is just as effective, at least initially, if you compare weight loss. And the research continues to show that 90 to 95% of health benefits, I think one of the authors of a large meta-analysis said up to 99% of the results of the improvement in biomarkers, blood pressure, blood sugar, lipids, et cetera, is attributable to the calorie deficit and weight loss itself. So,
and to be clear, before this gets clipped, this is contextual that Stan would recommend high quality food in your deficit.
Well, the very next sentence that got cut out of that clip was, I would never recommend the McDonald's diet. That, no, that's fine. And it's important because people started responding to that, and other, like Dr. Ids, he responded to the responses and said, no, weight loss does improve biomarkers and health. Yep. Now, there's many reasons why we would want to have a healthier diet, and obviously sufficient protein, satiety would be a huge, because eating ultra-processed foods is hard to maintain a deficit just because you're hungry all the time. As we've seen from the studies on ultra-processed foods, people just tend to spontaneously eat more calories, up to 500 a day. And so you want more high-satiety whole foods, more fiber, more protein. And then long-term, obviously, you want to have sufficient micronutrients, and you want to have, I think for those people who are susceptible to elevated ApoB, they should be watching their saturated fat intake and increasing their soluble fiber to try and bring that down for long-term health. And I know a lot of people say, well, I eat tons of this and tons of that, tons of cholesterol or tons of saturated fat, and I feel fine. It's not something you feel is the problem. It's a 30-plus year disease. It's an accumulation over many, many years. The average first age of a heart attack is 65. So when I hear a 35-year-old guy talking about how he eats tons of saturated fat and he feels great, I'm like, well, that ends. And here I am at 56, and I'm not speaking from a glass house here because I am speaking from a glass house here because I made all these mistakes in my early 20s and 30s, and I even made some conscious decisions adverse to my health, just to set certain records. I know that's what athletes do, but I can't responsibly sit here and suggest that you should just let your ApoB go crazy, particularly when I'm working with some of the biggest, strongest athletes in the world who, for them, after blood pressure and kidney and health, which blood pressure is kind of the primary driver of poor kidney health, we want to not accumulate plaque in their blood vessels so that long-term that their kids can grow up to have a dad when they get married and go to college and and have kids. And so I'm real cautious about that. So if I sound preachy, it's because I take it as a personal responsibility to use my platform, to benefit. And I don't want somebody tuning into me, and I don't want to be the guy saying, forget your ApoB, it doesn't matter. As long as, you're not insulin resistant.
Yeah, that's a huge. I actually did a podcast with Saladino the other day, and that's like the most, controversial of takes is if ApoB is inherently atherogenic to the endothelial wall, because it's like, he would assert, and what he does very prominently is that you, in the presence of high level metabolic health, essentially the number is almost irrelevant, with exception of the most genetically predisposed individuals that have, are incomparable to just the normal person who's on like a carnivore based diet. But then on the opposite side, you have people that say, like, no, actually it's causal in itself, it's problematic, and you should be aware of the number, not just for, monitoring, but in the sense that even in the presence of insulin sensitivity, you could still accumulate plaque just the same. And there's also unique genetic risk factors that aren't manipulated through lifestyle, like LP(a) and whatnot, that are very atherogenic. So it's kind of this weird thing, though, because it's like Paul is highly educated, very intelligent, speaks very articulately, has science to back some of his claims.
I'm glad you qualified.
Anyway, we get into that in our podcast.
Well, that's good. I'd love to listen to it. A problem with the science. I said this in my very first rant.
Yeah.
There's peer-reviewed published research to support either side of any argument.
Yeah.
That's not evidence. That's research.
Yeah.
So being research-based, citing a study, I just this morning, what's his name? Anthony
Chaffee?
Chaffee.
Yeah.
Was quoting the Ravanoff study. It's a review of some research.
I'm not familiar with this guy, but he's part of the kind of like carnivore
He's
crowd.
Paul Saladino 2.0.
But he's not.
Vegetables are poison.
He thinks keto carnivore is the way to go, though. My understanding.
Right. He's just the next evolution of that, and uses all the same tropes, I guess they can be called. But this morning's claim was that LDL people, elderly people who have higher LDLs live longer, and those who have lower LDLs die sooner. And there's kind of a U-shaped curve is what the claim is. But the
asserting that this is the protective biomarker you want to enhance.
Yes. And this is often what happens. People take a particular study like that, and they'll take these giant logical leaps into outcomes. And a lot of people do this with performance-enhancing stuff, too, and they'll claim that there's just a more meaningful outcome than it is, and it's really probably very minor in terms of benefits. But specific to that, I commonly hear that, I talked about it on the Mark Bell show, is that the problem with that is that these people with lower LDLs have some sort of terminal condition, cancer, tumors, liver disease, and the like that drives LDL down. And so it's correlative. It's not
So it's like an example of cherry picking.
It is cherry picking. It's reverse causation. And even the authors of the study that Rafknoff, I'm mispronouncing his name, but he's quite commonly makes these same types of claims based on very little evidence. They said that he misinterpreted the research, and they used a particularly derogatory term, but it's very common. That's one of the claims that people make. I was on a panel just a couple weeks ago, not like I'm the LDL expert of the world, but I had spoken about just general health for my clients, and I'm quick to reference the resources, the people that I get these from, the domain-specific professionals with PhDs, such as Tom Dayspring and others. But the same statement was made that people with higher LDLs live longer, and I told them it's reverse causality. And that's the problem with a lot of these things that people have put out there. Ty Schultz is famous for that. And I read Gary Taub's book, and many years ago, I thought it was a fascinating book. He's a journalist. He's a great writer. The problem is when when you review the references, and I'm saying you or me, but I'm saying people like Red Pen Reviews. Have you read Red Pen Reviews before? They've got 7 PhD researchers on nutrition that'll go in and check all of the resources, all the references on a lot of these books that are written, and then give an accuracy, a percentage of accuracy and healthfulness and the like. It's really interesting when you see so many MDs writing books and they just get absolutely crucified when you go in and start analyzing their claims and their references. And that's a very important word, claims. When people start making claims without sufficient evidence. And I know that circles us back to Gary Brecka. He makes a lot of claims that aren't scientifically supported, and he's getting torn apart on social media right now with a host of actual nutrition professionals pointing out why those claims aren't accurate. He got Dana to lose weight, and Dana lost 35 pounds. And Dana was complaining about the fact that his doctors are terrible. They just put me on blood pressure medication, and Of course, if you walked into my office 35 pounds overweight and your blood pressure was 180 over 100, I'd give you blood pressure medication too. But ultimately, it's the individual's responsibility to lose the weight. The weight is the driver.
And it would be while you work your way down to a healthy weight to get off the medication.
Sure.
Is like the logical.
Sure. I've recommended blood pressure medication for steroid users for years. That's something you don't want to let go unchecked if you're going to continue to take that stuff. If you're going to continue to be overweight and drink and not exercise, you probably should be on blood pressure medication. If you want to get off blood pressure medication and when you get off your CPAP, then you probably should lose 30, 40 pounds to get down to a healthy weight. And that's ultimately what Dana did. And it wasn't because, I hate to say, it was because Gary convinced him that he was going to die in 10 years using the biological clock, which there's no evidence to suggest. But I could do a blood test on someone and give them a whole bunch of reasons why they're not, why they're going to potentially die sooner without trying to estimate an exact date. And by creating that sense of urgency, thereby, it might compel someone to actually get off their ass and start to lose the weight. Hey, buddy, you're going to die in 5 years. You're going to have a heart attack. That's easy to tell. High blood pressure, triglycerides at 700, which was in Dana's circumstance. There wasn't anything magical done there. And it's not a knock on Gary. The knocks on Gary is that he just keeps saying stuff that's not evidentiary.
It's wild how little of the content is centered around the calorie deficit and the exogenous testosterone that he put Dana on.
I'm not taking any medication now. This is all just supplements.
Yeah, your blood pressure was 116 over 85 the last time the nurse took it. Testosterone stayed right in the upper end of the range because we're doing TRT, hormone replacement therapy, not a huge deal there. Another couple things that are amazing, he'd never had his level of homocysteine checked.
Hormone replacement therapy, not a huge deal there.
Right.
Yeah, it's like this whole spiel for 2 hours about methylated B vitamins and your MTHFR polymorphism that almost everyone has that obviously, at least from what we've seen, isn't that detrimental overall to longevity, or else you would have this massive subsection of people with great, MTHFR function who would be living way longer than everyone else. And it's just not how it plays out. And it's just wild.
Yeah, I've always said a lot of people tend to major in the minors, and I've done that. Ever since scrolling through microfiche, as I told you in college, I was looking for that one biohack, which is just a term that's nauseating because those are things that just rarely have evidence for any meaningful outcome. I did a podcast many years ago, and I was speaking about a lot of these very things, and I was speaking about sleep optimization and a healthy diet, however you view that. It brings up a whole lot of different opinions. And regular exercise. And somebody commented, Stan just keeps repeating himself. Well, it's because I talk about the things that actually work. And there's so many popular influencers now that they, as I mentioned earlier, they'll talk about mechanisms and rat studies and then make these giant logical leaps to talk about you should do this and apply these extraordinary percentages of benefit. And the outcomes, that's majoring in the minors. Very often. I mean, if you're not deficient in something, then you're probably not going to get a significant bump, particularly micronutrients. I've been a big proponent of vitamin D. Get a blood test. If you're deficient, take vitamin D. But if your vitamin D is at 50 or 60, taking more of it's not going to help. Right? And we saw that with not Ansel Keys. We saw it with who did the vitamin high vitamin, the vitamin E and vitamin A. Names escapes me now, but it'll come back to me. But we found out that it actually increased all-cause mortality when you started taking excess amounts of particular vitamins, especially in isolation and not with food. And so I'm just cautious about making recommendations to people like something's magical because I've tried all. Don't you think I've spent untold time and resources? I've tapped into some of the best minds in the business, traveled all over the world, and worked with the best coaches. And there's very little outside of those big rocks that gives you a meaningful benefit.
What is interesting, so I want to get your opinion on this. So when it comes to supplements, like you said, some of them, may be more harmful than helpful in some circumstances. Are there certain vitamins or minerals you think the RDAs are nonsensical for and are difficult to hit through diet, though, that supplementation
you hit on the nail on the head, because the same would be true of protein.
Yeah.
The 0.8 grams per kilogram protein recommendation from the RDA, which is kind of a minimum amount that you need just to not, what 96% of the population needs because they use 2 orders on top of what they felt would be deficient, 2 orders of magnitude. So the 0.8 is not optimal for performance. And so you go to the researchers. You look at, again, Stu Phillips has done some of the major work in this area. And he recommends a minimum of 1.2 grams per kilogram. And he's said more recently that anything north of 1.6 grams per kilogram, even for bodybuilders, probably isn't going to be give you any more muscle benefit. That's not to say you couldn't eat more protein. There might be some other benefits. Satiety would be the primary one. But in terms of stimulating MPS, as you mentioned, the leucine threshold, I mean, once you get 2.5 grams of leucine, you've sufficiently stimulated muscle protein synthesis. 5 grams isn't going to do any better.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the same thought with protein.
What if you're enhanced, though?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. But I would argue that you'd probably need less protein if you're enhanced because you become more efficient.
The thing I always find interesting, though, is you become more efficient. So people use it as a justification to eat the same amount as a natural despite having a higher rate potential of assimilation. So it's like, do I want to get the same amount as a natural, even though I'm like literally taking drugs, and push carbs more? Or what would your approach generally be?
Well, now if you're in a calorie surplus and pushing carbs more, now that's protein sparing.
But let's just say, in general, like I understand you work with an array of athletes with different performance demands based on their sport contextually. But if somebody is taking super physiological hormones and has this heightened capacity to accrete, protein or whatever, what would you be saying as far as like general principles to diet? Because in naturals, they will say, okay, well, if you have upwards of a gram per pound, like you're set. Never go over that. You're good. Don't worry about it. In enhanced, would you say the same and just push carbs harder because you can handle more based on, and you can train harder, so you need the carbs? Or what would your approach generally be? That
would depend. If you're in a calorie surplus, I would like to get you to get a little more protein. Having said that, it doesn't take a lot of extra protein to build muscle. And even in enhanced, you're not going to build muscle at 10 times the rate of a natty.
Sure.
You just want to be in a sufficient surplus. The only reason I would be cautious, like I've got one of Hafþór's biggest challenges, one of Lane Johnson's biggest challenges was being able to eat enough calories. So if I start pushing protein up, and he's
at the detriment of overall calories, never achieving the level
that becomes the challenge. Am I getting a significantly better benefit from the added protein? Probably not, but I'm losing in terms of his total caloric intake if I can't get his calories up. He had a diet given to him by a registered dietitian. Again, not a knock on registered dietitians. The co-author of my book, Dr. Damon McCune, is a PhD RDN who was director of dietetics at UNLV. We spent years working together, hundreds of hours, making sure that we supported all of the recommendations that we made with peer-reviewed published research. And I'm just saying that at some point there has to be a practicality. His diet, Lane Johnson's diet originally was tons and tons of chicken and like 5 or 6 cups of quinoa a day. Good luck eating. I mean, if you ever tried 5 or 6 cups of quinoa a day, I mean, it would wreck you. So calories are king. The first thing we had to do was get him into a surplus. And I'm willing to make a lot of sacrifices in terms of dietary quality to achieve that end, because Lane gets paid to perform at a particular level, and he feels as though 330 is that weight, not 312. Plus, he's less susceptible to injury at the heavier weight. This year was one of his better years. The last couple of years, he was a little lighter, and he had some recurring leg injuries. So, nonetheless, I would propose that I use protein as a satiety mechanism, and I will bring it down. I brought it down with Hafþór as well. He didn't need to eat 400 grams of protein a day to maybe 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, so I can push calories as a priority. And I would flip the script and do just the opposite with somebody dieting because I want to increase satiety. I'd give them 1.2, 1.3 grams per pound, not because I think that it's going to give them better lean mass performance, but because it's going to satiate them, which is largely what the carnivore diet does.
Yep.
Look, it's not my intention to shit on anybody's diet. We talked about keto, we talked about vegan, we talked about carnivore. Look, the best diet's the one you'll follow. Mm-hmm. And the weight loss itself is the primary driver of health benefits. And we talked about all the other considerations beyond that in terms of biomarkers and micronutrients. But I even said in my Myosin seminar years ago that the carnivore diet is the ultimate elimination diet. Mm-hmm. It's the only single food that you could consume that would get you the vast majority of what you needed to be able to survive. Yeah. Substitute that with any other single food and see how quickly that you would decline. You know, either insufficient protein or micronutrients, which red meat is robust in so many. But I suggest that as an initial intervention. Same thing with Thomas DeLauer and his 100-pound weight loss on keto. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Keto worked for him. Okay, it allowed him to stay in a deficit. It felt the least restrictive. He wasn't too hungry. He didn't overeat, and in so much as that accomplished that end, then it was the right diet for him. Mm-hmm. Now he's since evolved from that being the best diet for everybody, which for many years that was, he was, because that's how he lost weight. Yeah. He was, banging that drum that this is what everybody should do and it's the best. But when we compare diets, there isn't a best. They all have a similar, outcome in terms of weight loss, which is paltry to begin with, because we as individuals tend to have poor adherence long-term on any diet. There's no magic diet. None of them, nobody can demonstrate to me or in any research that vegan or keto or paleo or vertical, I'll put myself in there, performs any better in terms of long-term dietary adherence or weight loss. They all have a similar recurrence and weight regain. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not my intent to crap on anybody's diet. I just say that you have to meet your customer or your client where they're at. Mm-hmm. And if overeating is their problem, then you gotta try and figure out a diet that's going to make them feel more satiated. And if IBS is their problem, then we're going to have to probably get them onto a low FODMAP diet, or maybe even a more extreme solution than that, just at least as an initial intervention. Then I would suggest that you don't just stay there. Mm. Obviously, the carnivore suggests that you add some eggs in, you'd add some yogurt in, add some salmon in. Those are all great suggestions. But if your ApoB's skyrocketing, you may want to consider watching the total saturated fat intake and maybe introducing some possibly low FODMAP soluble fibers, which there's many. Lentils in small portions, it's kind of dose dependent. So there's lots of things you can do to try and increase the diversity of someone's diet so they don't feel so restrictive. And that's what Peter T. ultimately figured out, is that when performance became the priority, mm-hmm. Same thing with Paul Saladino, same thing with Mike Mutzel, same thing with many, many others. When performance becomes the priority, strength, hypertrophy, because we've seen more recently, everybody's like, damn, this is really probably the priority. Mm-hmm. It's as Gabrielle Lyons says, the sink for glucose. Yep. There's so many important things about what muscle does for the body. When those workouts became a priority, all those folks started to see the importance and the benefit, the personal benefit, and the research supporting that having sufficient carbohydrates improves that bout of training. And that bout of training and your ability to maximally invest in that and stimulate, take your body somewhere it hasn't been before so it can grow, that becomes harder and harder and harder. Once the newbie gains are gone and they're in there banging away and they realize, oh crap, I can't train very hard because I don't have, my diet doesn't include sufficient carbohydrates to fuel this anaerobic workload. Then they start making these changes. I think CrossFit did it initially with paleo. Remember, paleo came in and like, well, you can't eat potatoes, and these CrossFitters were starting to bonk, and they, and then they're like, I need more carbohydrates, and suddenly paleo was like, oh, okay, potatoes are okay. When you're outcome oriented, you stop worrying about your nutrition religion.
Now, one thing a lot of people do seem to report as a positive out of keto or carnivore is this mental clarity that is sustained throughout the day with no dips, spikes. It's just very stable, sharp, focused, productive, efficient mental clarity versus oftentimes when people have carbohydrate rich diet models, they will experience this kind of like roller coaster of energy and then slumps, and then kind of like after a couple hours they're back at it. And in general, do you think that that's not a knock on the inclusion of carbohydrates and more the disposal of glucose and the actual ability to assimilate nutrients well?
100%. I was about to say that 70% of our population is pre-diabetic or diabetic, and so obviously all of those people would benefit from reducing carbohydrates. I've never suggested that somebody who's insulin resistant should be eating a ton of carbohydrates, particularly some of the refined carbohydrates that I might recommend for an athlete who's training twice a day. In the vertical diet, I talk a lot about rice, white rice. It's only for people who are training a lot, who are insulin sensitive, athletes in general.
So a lot of people aren't getting blood work, although I would absolutely recommend they do, but as a proxy of insulin sensitivity and metabolic health, if somebody's eating their lunch and all of a sudden they're incapacitated with fatigue for the next hour and a half, you think that's a red flag?
It'd be a great time to go get a blood test and find out. The problem is as you know, fasted glucose and HA1C can stay in the normal range for a decade or more while you are accumulating some degree of insulin resistance that's probably more recognizable. I call those lagging indicators. And the leading indicators are going to be your triglycerides and your fasted insulin. And fasted insulin has a very broad range. I think it's
huge.
4 to 22, and
absurd.
and of course those ranges represent the general population, which, as we discussed, is 70% overweight or obese, 40% diabetic. So we want to keep that fasted insulin underneath about 5 would be great, 6, somewhere in there, if that's your interpretation. That's just my recommendation. If I see it get up to 9, 10, 11, 12, there's some insulin resistance going on there, and those carbohydrates can adversely affect you. This is where I kind of go back and forth with those continuous glucose monitors because apparently there is some availability problem, and people in the general population are utilizing them and fear-mongering over normal physiological elevations in glucose after a meal, which is quite normal. I
see a lot of posts about, look at how high it goes after you eat this. And it's like, that's
until that gets in excess of 140 is good. If you can keep it under 140 and then get it back down under 100 within the normal, we call the area under the curve, the postprandial glycemia, the peak elevation and duration of blood sugars. But how do you know? I mean, it's the same reason I want to get a blood test. How do you know? And that's why I'm so torn, because we don't see that continuous glucose monitors help people with weight loss. There's no evidence to suggest that they have better weight loss outcomes. But if, as mentioned in the Gary Brecka, Dana White situation, he convinced Dana White to lose weight, and based on what information and how valid that information was, some of them are quite obvious: 700 triglyceride, etc. CPAP, high blood pressure. But if someone starts to see that their blood glucose with a continuous glucose monitor goes up to 190 or stays elevated for an extended period of time, which may or may not be visible in a blood test with a fasted glucose after a 12-hour or a fasted insulin level after a 12-hour fast, that might be enough of a nudge for them to say, hey, I need to make a change. And then if they see the particular foods, which is always tough because we know the glycemic index, the blood sugar elevation was measured in isolation, and when you eat those foods in combination with proteins and fats, as most people would in a normal meal, you don't get the same increases, and different people respond differently to the same foods. It could be very different responses, glycemia, from eating the same foods. So, but if getting a glucose monitor would help an individual stop eating the kinds of foods that over time could start to create a problem in terms of insulin sensitivity, then I'm hard spent to argue against that. As at the same time, I'm recommending a blood test to do the same thing, to create awareness. Same reason you step on a scale. And that which gets measured gets improved. And I understand that adherence and recidivism is terrible, and that the vast majority of people regain the weight. But is that an excuse not to at least create a sense of awareness to try?
Yeah.
To improve those habits.
Yeah. I think the data, as much as it might not be the most actionable for everyone, if it like gives you a visual metric of where your health stands and your metabolic status that you can interpret as, it's in my face now with a visual representation of how poorly I'm responding to food intake, like that might be the kick in the ass people need. So I'm not to say that whatever the literature shows on, continuous glucose monitors, if they're useful or not, I do think some people learn enough about it to motivate them, but I definitely wouldn't blindly recommend everyone get one either.
And you'd say the same thing about a food tracking app, is that it may at least initially help you learn.
Yeah, you might be like, wow, I'm actually eating 3,600 calories instead of 2,800.
I didn't know there was 700 calories in a Starbucks vanilla latte.
Yeah,
until you look it up one time, then you're like,
When I first realized how bad my salads were, it was mind-boggling.
Yeah. Some of those meals that I talked about at Cheesecake Factory.
Not because salads are bad necessarily, but because of what I was putting in it, to be clear.
The bacon, the blue cheese, the dressing.
Oh, yeah, I would take the Kraft or whatever the worst one was and just drench the hell out of it.
And again, not a good food, bad food conversation. It's just that if you're not aware of how many calories are accumulating, we call hidden calories. It was kind of my foray into seed oils way back when I was looking at the obesity rate over the last 50 years, how it's climbed, and you could see, a perfect correlation between our increase in seed oil consumption. I even did a video, the real poison that's killing us, and demonizing seed oils at the time. And of course now we've got...
Oh, it's huge now.
Oh, it's huge. Everybody's all over the place with those, how they're manufactured, who manufactures them. And I've kind of moved my stance onto that, is that the vast majority of those are consumed as part of ultra-processed foods.
So you think
deep-fried foods.
The discussion gets conflated because you're getting the inclusion of basically garbage foods representing them as a whole, and some of them could be okay in certain circumstances, or how would you?
Yeah, well, we do see in the research that when you replace saturated fats with mono or polyunsaturated fats, you see a decrease in APOB. Mm-hmm. And we also don't see any increase in homocysteine or CRP, HSCRP. We don't see any inflammation markers that are measurable from the consumption of seed oils. As much as I hate it, because I did say in my rant, I said, I'm biased. They are a poison to me. I'm allergic to them. When I eat them, they give me diarrhea.
Yeah.
And I spoke about that. But that doesn't afford me the opportunity, as I just got done critiquing many other keto people, that doesn't afford me the opportunity to extrapolate that onto the masses without sufficient evidence.
Yeah, so like when Paul Saladino, for example, comes out with really aggressive claims about it, which, may or may not be founded, what are your general thoughts? Because oftentimes it's, I don't know, it's, you'll see a video from Lane Norton the next day, basically dismantling them, and then they're going back and forth, and sometimes it's hard to know as the layman. These are both highly intelligent individuals who are well educated and seem to do the research. So who am I supposed to listen to?
Yeah. Well, if you rely on epidemiology, but we have many now randomized controlled trials showing, and then oftentimes they will cherry pick a study. I think one of them was they're going to escape me now, the Sydney Diet Heart Trial. And then there was another one out of, I think, Michigan. They were horribly conducted studies. The trans fats were in the mix involved there, the length of the study, the number of participants. There was just so many problems. When they continue to go back to the same two studies, which are horribly confounded, and then completely disregard all of the current research. We have mechanistic data, we have epidemiology, we have randomized controlled trials, and we have Mendelian randomization. All pointing in the same direction, and they'll continue to bring up these same stories. And then they conflate it with, and you can hold these two beliefs equally, they conflate it with, big oil or big sugar or big pharma or, whatever else.
Sure.
You can believe that big food is a bad thing, generally, that they're profit-driven, and, you can believe that and understand, again, the evidence, not the research, the body of the overall evidence, looking at the body of research, and agree that they're not poisonous. There's no evidence to that. Point to a biomarker. All you can point to is if in excess. The same thing's true of say fructose and high fructose corn syrup versus sugar. They've had many replacement studies, swapping one for the other, and it's calorie driven. When the calories are in excess, then you start to see the fatty liver accumulation. You don't see some special problem with eating one or the other of those, and it's frustrating. And I can already see the comment section. I've watched it over and over and over again. Folks just freaking out because they just haven't bothered to deep dive into the research and look at the comparisons. And these are Examine.com's taken a deep dive into these things. Obviously, Lane Norton has another great resource that Alan Flanagan from Alinian Nutrition is just brilliant. Does brilliant analysis on research. And he's criticized me multiple times over the years for claims that I've made. One being seed oils, and one being shitting on Ansel Keys, which he correctly pointed out that I didn't read Ansel Keys' entire research study. Somebody who's famous for that is again Nina Teicholz. She has a whole book, blaming big this and big that, and conspiracy theories here and conspiracy theories there. But when you come down to the actual evidence on the nutrient itself, it's very shaky, if not just horrible. And Gary Taubes did the same thing. And I mean, his wife is recently apologizing on his behalf for, saying he wasn't doing this intentionally. He has a good heart and he meant well, but he was wrong. Dr. Jason Funk's wrong about the carbohydrate insulin model. It's been disproven over and over and over again. And people think if you eat a grape that your blood sugar is going to elevate and you won't be able to burn fat. Gary Brecka's on that board, carbohydrate insulin model. He's just driving that whole thing. It's not true. Who was the gentleman recently that just, he spiked his blood sugar every single day, ate sugar every single day for a month and lost weight? Jordan Syatt.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. It's a fantastic job. Just demonstrating it's the calories. It's not that your blood sugar elevates. That's a normal physiological response. If you're diabetic, you probably should reduce your carbohydrates, not to experience those fluctuations while you get your weight down and get sufficient fat storage to where you can manage blood sugars, or increase your lean body mass to manage blood sugars. I just recently said that if I'm making a recommendation, this goes back to Lane Johnson, Hafþór Bjornsson, Mitchell Hooper, all of the pro strongmen that I've worked with over the years, Brian Shaw, all of them. I recommended that they drop some weight, get themselves insulin sensitive, and then we took their weight back up, but we kept their fats low, particularly their saturated fats. We just took out bacon and butter and coconut oil. It's pretty much that simple. And it put in a lot more dairy for those protein sources, and salmon, monounsaturated fats, and then drove carbohydrates initially, if we could, with some oatmeal or some sourdough, or some things that wouldn't quickly convert to triglycerides in the liver. But eventually, calories are king. We'd start throwing in, the rice as needed for them to be able to get the calories necessary to gain weight. So we got Hafþór back up to 440 pounds, and he had a much reduced blood pressure than he had previously, and he had much better blood markers as he had previously. And so, he performed quite well and was quite healthy in comparison to having maintained that heavy weight year round.
How common is it for individuals, especially at that level of sport and really large individuals, to actually get rid of their sleep apnea via getting lean? Because even personally, I still use a CPAP even when I get under 10% body fat.
Yeah, I mentioned this in a previous episode. There are people just based on the thickness of their neck, weightlifters who have, and I mentioned Jordan Fagenbaum from Barbell Medicine. He's 198 pounds, quite lean, six-pack abs. He wears a CPAP. He has sleep apnea as a result of a thick neck, muscular neck. It could be just a crowding of the airway, and it's common with people who have a lot of excess body fat, but it also can occur. And I've tried everything. I've been on a CPAP since I got north of, say, 240 pounds. I started waking up tired, and it was like falling asleep on the way to work in the morning. I can't even nap without one. I'm worse off. I'm more tired than when I went to sleep. Yeah. And going back as far as 1993, and that's when they were actually CPAPs, continuous positive airway pressure. And it was like driving down the freeway with no windshield. It's just all night long. And you wake up in the morning and your belly's bloated and you're burping. And
I think one thing that should be noted is when I talk about it, probably when you talk about it, when most people talk about it, we call it CPAP, but it's not continuous.
It's a BiPAP. Yeah. When you exhale now, they have what's called expiratory pressure relief. And you can actually set that to be greater or less. With some varying degree of efficiency. If you have less if you have more expiratory pressure relief, then there's a chance you might get a little less air.
And to be clear too, like the reason I prefaced this question, I said this question to begin with about if you get lead, could you still have it? Is because I don't want to give people the impression like when Dana got off his CPAP via Gary Brecka and lost a bunch of weight, it doesn't necessarily mean that once you're healthy, you won't have sleep apnea. Mm-hmm. Like you may still have it even if everything is dialed in. Yeah. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. And you should stay on it if you need it.
No, I agree 100%. And the only way to tell that is...
Because some guys, their goal is to get off of it. And they're like, I have visible abs and my blood work looks good, so I'm going to get off of it. And it's like, this is a anatomical, like structural thing. You can't
It may very well be for some people.
For some people.
Yeah. I remember when I went in to get my CPAP back in the early 90s and did the sleep study and all that stuff. I think most people tell these stories about how many times they're holding their breath at night, and it can cause a 20-point elevation in blood pressure. It has a whole host of adverse effects, thickening of the blood, and that. And then I recall some years later thinking I was going to be able to get off the CPAP by utilizing one of the alternate methods, one of which was, at the time, some quack was lasering off uvulas.
Whoa, that's crazy.
I went in and actually had it lasered off the uvula, thinking that it was like collapsing and clogging the airway. That's
crazy.
And I mean, it's testimony or evidence that not all doctors know what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah, I almost got not that maybe I would benefit from it to some extent, but I almost got deviated septum fixed, which may help me, but also my turbinates cauterized. And I've heard of people having empty nose syndrome. I don't know how common it really is, but I use a nose mask now and I can breathe fine through it. So I don't think it would have actually helped my sleep apnea at the end of the day.
Right. And this goes back to Dana as well. I mean, and he said, you talked about how these doctors just put them on medication. Not all doctors are good at what they do. And I've gotten lots of bad information over the years. I was in the position to where I could see anybody I wanted whenever I wanted. And I had plenty of help along the way. And I would get advice from a particular doctor, and I would go to another doctor and ask about that advice. And they'd be like, oh, no. And that's a frustrating place to be. So I can see where Dana got frustrated is that obviously it's the individual responsibility. I went and got my uvula lasered off. It's my responsibility, but I trusted that this guy knew what he was doing and that it was going to be a solution. And then later went in and got stents put in my throat. The little plastic stents, they put them in there to keep it from collapsing. Mm-hmm. That didn't work. That was extremely painful as well. And then I tried the mouth.
Yeah, the appliance thing.
The appliance, and that can actually change your bite.
That's what Joe uses.
Yeah, I'd be
Seems
cautious.
to work for him, but
be cautious with that. Yeah. And I guess it depends. Joe isn't, he isn't. Maybe he has sleep apnea. Isn't just one diagnosis.
Yeah,
it's there's degrees to.
Yeah, and it also even depends how you sleep. Because if I fell asleep on this chair on my side or on my stomach, I actually wouldn't apnea. But I lie on my back. And for me, on my back, everything falls into itself, and the gravity is what screws me over, and then I apnea.
Right. So anyhow, I guess my point is that weight loss would be your first objective for apnea, but it doesn't cure everyone, and most of these alternatives are pretty insufficient or ineffective for most people. I haven't seen anything that works yet, and I've been looking very closely for years. 1997, I stopped competing. I was 300 pounds at the time, and it wasn't until 2006 I came back to competing. During that time, I completely went off of testosterone. I thought that I would, I got the surgery, and I thought I'd be able to fix myself. It was a horrible 9+ years. It was absolutely horrible. I just remember at the time how tired I constantly felt, and how my weight dropped down to like 210 pounds. I didn't have sleep apnea. But at one point, because I was building businesses at the time, that's when I started. I started my first business. I was about 34 years old, or no, a little younger than that. But I went to work. I went to work for a large company, and then started my business a few years later. But I hadn't been in a gym in 2 years.
Wow.
You know, somebody who'd been training since 1985. Consistently. At one point, I didn't go to the gym for almost 2 years, and I did a video called "Stress for Success" on YouTube, where I talked about some of that time and how difficult it was, and how how overwhelming, and how anxiety started to creep in, and stress. And I started burning the candle at both ends, and sleeping 4 hours a night, and working around the clock. And you know the routine. I mean, you've built some successful.
Yeah, I kind of fell victim to that a little bit these past couple of years myself. Not to that extent, maybe, but I've definitely justified to myself, going to the gym once, a few times a week is fine. Or, 2 days a week, more important that I get this thing done. I'm almost at inbox zero. I'll just go 1 day this week. It's fine. I'll catch up next week. And then before you know it, you haven't gone to the gym for multiple weeks.
Right. Yeah, it was a long time for me. And then I went back to the gym after, it seems like it was almost 2 years off. First thing I did is I loaded up a bunch of weight on the squat and dropped down into the hole. Sciatica. It went right down that nerve all the way down to my heel, and I was out. I was out for months. I had back pain that I couldn't even sleep with, and so I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes over the years that I try and help prevent in my clients. Because a lot of the people that I deal with, I know it seems like I've talked about a lot of professional athletes, but the vast majority of my clientele are dad bods and soccer moms, and of all ages, to be honest. And but as they get into their 40s and 50s, they start to things start to feel differently. Whether it's hormonal or otherwise, both men and women, with perimenopause and the like, and they just want to feel better. They want to sleep better. They want to have more energy. But a lot of that takes, as I said in my Stress for Success video, and the reason I called it Stress for Success is that's a book by an author, Jim Lohr. And I went to a Barnes & Noble one day looking for a solution for stress. I was going to research and see how I could solve my stress, and of course, there's a lot of books on things like sauna or massage or meditation was big. It still is. But Jim Lohr was the one who said you need to look at your basic routines. How many hours of sleep are you getting? How much are you exercising? And what's your diet look like? Mm-hmm. At the time, I was eating dollar meals at McDonald's, because I was broke. I started a business. I sold my home. I moved into a little apartment, and I ran up credit cards, and I was trying to make a business become successful. And I started, re-implementing those routines, and everything changed for me. And my business started to thrive, and I was more productive. I had more energy. But it wasn't until about 2006, 1997 through 2006, I didn't compete. 2006, I came back and competed, and I was done. I won the Emerald Cup in Seattle. That was my goal since I was, a young man up in Eugene, Oregon, Portland, Oregon. The Emerald Cup was like the biggest national qualifier in the country, and it was, it's been around for a long time, and all the greats went through there, and that was my local Mr. Olympia. And so I won that in 2006, and I wasn't going to compete again. I was done. I was having fun. I was very wealthy. At the time, I'd built up my companies, and I had a Rolls Royce, a $2 million home on a lake, and boats and Sea-Doos, and then flying first class down to sit in the second row behind Donald Trump at the UFC fights. And wow. Yeah, it was good times. Then the real estate market collapsed, and that all took a shit real fast, because I was highly vested in I had numerous multifamily properties and hundreds of units, and I had a single-family subdivision under construction at the time, and commercial properties, and so I was fully vested in real estate with as little as 3% down on a lot of those properties. And when the market, receded by 30-40% overnight, and the banks started coming knocking, asking for me to pay down the loans, so they had a 20% debt to equity. It was overwhelming at the time, but I finally got back into. That's about when I met up with Flex Wheeler, because that was 2008. So when the real estate market collapsed, 2007, 2008, right in there. And I met up with Flex Wheeler at the time, and I was going to help a friend of mine compete. And I flew down to the Gold's Venice. That's where we met first, was Gold's Venice. He lived in San Jose. And we went over to the Firehouse Restaurant, which I had been going to since probably as early as 1988, to watch people train and to try and ask questions where I could, and learn things about So I saw all the guys coming up in Venice and how they would work out. And, Paul DeMeo, you know, everybody trained down there at the time. And Flex sat down with me. I had my yellow pad of paper.
So how did you get to this circumstance where you're eating with Flex to begin with?
A friend of mine, Keith Williams, had met Flex, and Keith was going to, and Flex was going to help him train for nationals to try and win a pro card.
Okay.
And Keith was really close to me. I had trained him for football back in the early 90s at the University of Oregon. I was training football players for the University of Oregon. And so I sat down with Flex with my yellow pad of paper and my pen, and we had an hour and a half lunch, and at the end of the hour and a half, I had nothing written on the paper. And I thought, you know, this Flex Wheeler, he's going to give me all the secrets. This is, you know, the Wizard of Oz. He's going to pull back the curtain. I'm finally going to get to see, you know, what goes on there. You know, he's going to have some special drug protocol, and he's going to have some special. And really, what he did is what I do to my clients or for my clients is he just gave me the nuts and bolts of what works, the big stuff. He says, you know, I'd like you to come down to San Jose. You'd probably stay there. You know, I'd like you to sleep, eat, and train. And so he sent me home with some information on how to gradually build my calories up, which I still utilize with a lot of my athletes now.
But this is during the time when the real estate is shitting the bed and you're stressed about entrepreneurial stuff. Yeah. And you decided, I'm going to go pro bodybuilding right now.
What else am I going to do? I had time. I had to, you know, everything else. It was just basically a fire sale, you know, selling everything out.
Okay.
My business partner and I were starting another company at the time, but he was primarily operating it, and so I just spent my time training during that time. It was just this single opportunity I had. And again, you know, I've said why I'm a hypocrite. I had no job. I had, you know, I had the financial wherewithal to where I could hire Flex, and I had time. I had no kids. I wasn't married.
So is this in your mid to late 30s right now? Just
38, 39 years old.
And no thought was given to, coming up on 40, should I be pushing this right now?
Yeah. Well, and that's, my health was good. It was really good. I generally stayed very lean.
Okay.
And again, you know, my protocols up until that point were very modest.
Yeah.
Talked about this years ago on podcasts at Mind Pump and again with Steve. Flex's protocols were very modest. He didn't believe in a lot of stuff. Well, I don't know what he personally used throughout his career, but I've worked with a lot of pro bodybuilders, and I've you know, worked with a lot of gurus, and it's, you know, they throw the kitchen sink at you, and it's grams of stuff.
Define kitchen sink, out of curiosity.
I'll get there.
Okay.
And so Flex's protocol was I think. It's kind of the same one that I recommend to my clients. It was 100 milligrams of Test Prop every other day. It was 100 milligrams of Permabulking every other day. It was, well, at the time, it was Masteron at the time. 100 milligrams of Masteron every other day. It was 50 milligrams of Winstrol a day. And we were using half...
Oral Winstrol?
Yeah, oral Winstrol. 37.5 milligrams of Tren every other day.
And this is for what phase? Off season or for contest?
Contest. This is a pre-contest deal. I use GH.
And this is off the rip, not titrating up to it, like starting from day one. This is your stack.
Yep, we started from day one. Yeah.
So you said Test P every other day, 100. Primo every other day, 100. Masteron every other day, 100. And then...
It wasn't both Primo and Masteron.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. Yeah, Test Prop, Masteron Prop, 100 milligrams every other day. Winstrol...
Oh, so no Primo.
50 milligrams every day, no Primo. We had Masteron. Tren acetate, 50 milligrams, or 37.5. It was a half. We had the 75 milligram.
Yeah, you had the actual
Tren.
amps.
Yeah, Tren at the time. Where we were making, we made it out of Phenoplex. Yeah, at the time. It's been a long time, but growth hormone, 2 IUs a day. I tried clenbuterol, but it made my heart race so fast that I had to get off of it. I ended up actually going to the doctor because my trachea was collapsing because Flex's training is high volume, short rest periods. So I was actually, you know, because I couldn't get my air, and my heart was racing really, really fast. So I had to get off the
Stints didn't help you.
No. So anyhow, pretty reasonable. I got shredded for that show. Yeah. I maintained a lot more mass because I didn't do any cardio at all, not 0, not 1, not even a 10-minute walk at the time. We just trained twice a day, but they were a lot of volume, usually 16 sets per muscle group, AM, PM training. So we do chest in the morning and shoulders and tris at night. And we
to failure on?
Not really. He hit a lot of volume. Rest periods were generally not more than 90 seconds, which I don't necessarily recommend that today with the research that we've got with Schoenfeld. nor that high a volume, although there's a big debate going on right now, of course, in the exercise phys community about endless volume still continuing to give you results up to 52 sets a week per body part. But also, you've got lots of good research suggesting that anything after 6 to 10 sets in a given workout for a body part is probably diminishing returns.
And we have no literature on enhanced pro bodybuilders.
Yeah. We did a lot of volume, short rest periods, and got the best shape of my life. I think I was 252 on stage at the Masters Nationals when I won. Wow. I think the next day for the photo shoot, I was like 246. My body was just kept going. And Flex had me eating a ton. It was 4 pounds of steak a day, 600 grams of carbs. We were eating a lot.
Did you do blood work back then, by chance?
I did, yeah. And blood work was still pretty good back then, especially in bodybuilding. It was really good. Well, and then everything went to hell from there because I went out to Mark Bell's in Sacramento.
Okay.
And Mark had a very different ideas for a powerlifting protocol was. And so I came off of that prep. Well, I didn't come off. I prepped for the Masters Nationals and won my pro card. And then immediately that following week, I drove from San Jose to Sacramento and I stayed in an extended stay over there and started training with Mark Bell. 7 weeks later, we had a meet to do. Just in 7 weeks from being on stage as a pro bodybuilder at whatever I was, single digit percentage body fat. 7 weeks later, Mark, his protocol was 750 test, 750 EQ, 750 DECA.
Yeah, by the way, when you had these compounds selected, what was the thought process going into like Flex Wheeler giving you these compounds versus Mark Bell, this protocol? Presumably, and this is a really interesting topic, a lot of people are curious about is the difference between bodybuilder versus powerlifting stacks in general and the logic that goes behind like optimal selection.
Even at that time, bodybuilders were focused more on not taking things that would cause water retention or estrogen conversion. And so that's why it was the shorter esters with the more frequent injections. And then the powerlifters didn't care. They kind of wanted the extra water weight, the extra weight gain. Calories drove both ends of the process, but even back then, I didn't take any anti-estrogens working with Flex, but I didn't have elevated estrogen. I was getting blood tests during that time through an online organization at the time that I used for 10 years until I came across you, and it was one of the first things I asked you. Said, "Can we bring these prices down?"
Yeah.
And you did a phenomenal job, by the way. And I was so pleased because I could go out to all my clients and say, "Look, you got to get a blood test." Because before I would say that it would be like $400.
Yeah.
And then
it's the crazy thing is I used to use your
blood
link for the private MD
That's
or
right.
whatever it was.
That's right.
And that's where I would drive down the States.
350, 360 bucks a pop, and you
Yeah.
have a more comprehensive profile for half that.
Yeah, really appreciate you, all the support on that side, by the way, man. Like,
Yeah.
it's been huge having your message out there and encouraging people to get preventative, screening and diagnostics and
talking
learning
about
more.
it for years before I met
Yeah.
you, and it was a win-win that you were able to bring that to the clients for so affordable. It's, again, not an advertisement, but still our firm belief that everybody should get a blood test, and that if it's convenient and cost-effective, they're more likely to be able to do it. So I connected with Mark, and next thing you know, I was doing that protocol, and then D-ball was, we started at 25 and then worked up to 50. Anytime I ever tried getting north of 50 milligrams a day of D-ball, I would lose my appetite. I mean, just completely gone.
Back pumps are ruthless, too.
Yeah, they're pretty ruthless. I tried Anadrol one time, and within a week, I just had migraines, so I could never tried it again. But that was my protocol for that 2009, the fall of 2009 with Mark, and I think it was a 22, 21 total beat KKs, constant lost world record at the time. Now, I talked earlier about the early 90s and how strong I got using 2 cc's of Sustanon a week and 20 milligrams of D-ball a day, 782-pound deadlift, and I was benching, mid-fives at the time, and I don't really recall. I think my squat in competition, I didn't do a lot of competitions in the early 90s. I was doing a lot of gym lifts. I thought the stronger I get, the bigger I'd get.
Yeah.
Another horrible lesson that it's just not true.
Yeah, what do you tell a guy, too, when he's like, because I see a lot of people, when they're young especially, they are pushing insane amounts of weight, but their numbers objectively, strength metric-wise, reflect that of the highest level of bodybuilding professionals, if not exceeding it, but then they still are lagging 50 pounds of lean mass. Like, where's the delta of, what do you tell them for how do they push past that when there's, like, you can't really progressively overload much more without injuring yourself, probably.
No, and we know now from looking at Schoenfeld's research and others that it's the range of motion. That typically, powerlifters will only take the weight through whatever range of motion is necessary to, and in the gym, less than that. But if you want to get maximum hypertrophy results, you're going to have to take that muscle into the lengthened position.
So what would you tell a guy who's in the gym on chest day, benching 405 for reps, or he's deadlifting, whatever, like 700 pounds or something, but he still has to gain 70 pounds or 50 pounds more lean to be competitive at the IFBB level?
I'd suggest if you're benching 405 for reps, you got a pretty big guy. It's pretty rare you're going to see him. Now, you can see somebody deadlifting a significant amount, as I did, who had a lot of ass and a lot of spinal erectors, but not a lot of quad and hamstring. Because I never trained through a significant range of motion for quads and hamstrings. Even on squatting, I would cut it short, and I would low bar it, and I would have vertical shin. So that was my mistake. When Flex trained me in San Jose, he wouldn't let me do a single squat, a single bench, or a single deadlift. The whole time that we were training together, he told me to stop doing those powerlifting movements because I had kind of maxed out whatever muscle I was going to gain from those positions. And he would put me into positions where I got a greater range of motion. He took me from, for chest, for instance, my shoulders were dominant, but my chest wasn't. And that's pretty common that some people, if a group of people bench, some will have a big chest, some will have big shoulders, some will have big triceps. People tend to respond differently. It's kind of individualistic. So he put me on dumbbells, but a lot deeper. I do those 200-pound dumbbells, but it's kind of a circus sideshow trick because those things are so long that if I just angle them slightly, and then they hit here.
Right.
Not very deep. But Flex made me go way deep, and so and we'd lighten the weight up, and we'd control the eccentric. When I'm doing the 200-pound dumbbells, I'm just boing, bouncing them off. So I don't control. So he made me control the eccentric. I'm not talking about 10-second negative. I'm just talking somewhere 2 to 5 seconds, 2 to 4 probably in there, which is what the literature suggests that's probably a good range, and that a longer eccentric is more beneficial. I know there's some coaches out there to try and do these 20-second negatives, and just isn't any evidence to that. But same with legs. We got on a leg press, and he'd move my feet in and down a little bit, just make sure we looked at the knee angle as opposed to the hip angle. I was getting more ass and hips from leg press than I was getting quads. Lots of lunges, walking lunges. Again, a lot of knee angle, knee over toe. Kind of thing, but that's how he, a lot of leg extensions. He really liked leg extensions, which I didn't do a whole lot of when I was powerlifting. And we know that the the brachioradialis is uniquely trained from the leg extension, whereas it's not so much on the squat. And so we did a lot of that kind of stuff. He had me do adductors, abductors. Flex had a pretty narrow muscle at the knee, which I do as well. But he had these huge adductors, and he would position himself such that the adductors would touch in the middle, and so he was good at displaying his body that way. But that was that's how that training went. And then when I went to Mark's, it was obviously we're just squat, bench, and deadlift is all it is. I gained 37 pounds of body weight in less than 7 weeks, probably in 4 weeks.
Jeez.
You saw Larry Wheels recently talk about how he competed at 235 and he was 285 a week later. Yeah. That was my experience at that moment. I put on 37 pounds in probably just a few weeks. I went from struggling with a 405 squat to the next thing we were doing a month later, 800-pound squats. Damn. Over the course of that time. My legs shrunk 1 inch.
That's crazy.
And when I told Mark that, he said, "You measure your legs? How gay is that?"
It sounds like a Mark answer.
It's a Mark Bell answer. Yeah. So, but and I guess the point being is that, getting stronger doesn't make you bigger. I didn't have much volume, much range of motion. And I'd put on all that weight and still, had actually lost an inch on my legs. And so that was a great program in 2009. When trying to get across is I know a lot of people hear, "Oh, what'd you take?" and then they want to take that. And that was a successful competition, but it wasn't necessarily because of how much stronger I got from when I was competing in the 90s. Mark changed my technique considerably. I used to do a much closer stance on the squat, and we went to a little higher bar rather than me bending over as much. So I used to have a pretty vertical torso. I squatted like, I want to say 765 earlier that year in competition, buried it pretty deep, deeper than I needed to go. And I squatted, I think it was an 821 at Mark's competition. People say, well, that's a huge increase. Is that because of the higher gear that you took? Ronnie talked about this years ago. Ronnie Coleman said he didn't get much stronger when he increases the dose. He got a lot bigger. I think most of that had to do with the fact that Mark had considerably changed my form because my deadlift wasn't any better. I think my deadlift was a 777. I just deadlifted 782 in 1993. So that wasn't any better. And although my bench was a little better, earlier that year I'd benched a 550 with really bad elbows. I had super, super sore elbows. Again, on 500 milligrams of Sustanon, 20 megs of D-ball was in like March of 2009 when I totaled 2,070. I think it was 2,070. I told 2121 with Mark. I think a lot of that was coaching. A lot of that was coaching. I didn't have the elbow problems because we used some SSB bar, and so I wasn't doing low bar. Mark had me bring my hands out here. So again, I wasn't ruining my elbows and and shoulders for the bench. I wasn't overstretching. Deadlift was about the same as it was in the early 90s. The bench went up mostly as a lack of pain, and I think the squat was primarily from just me finding a position, much the same way you see Larry Wheels squat. Neither one of us, we're so lean, we don't really bounce off our own body. You see a Dan Green or a Chad Wesley Smith, and they're like Bosu balls. They have so much mass around their waist and butt and hamstrings and quads that they squish against themselves. And I always thought that would be great, but I don't have that. And so I had a pretty wide stance, and I had to control that weight the whole time because there was no cushion for me to go into. I just had to find my spot in returns. It's kind of precarious. When I watch Larry squat, I think there's an injury, short, right ahead. And it's the same way I used to squat. But that was 2009, and then I did another bodybuilding show, same protocol as Flex. I would cruise, and then went back on the same protocol as Flex.
Was there an amount that you had to cruise on to maintain an IFBB physique that like often you'll see people cruising on the same amounts, even though one guy is 50 pounds lighter than another guy. It's like, hey, you didn't actually need this dose to achieve symptom relief for your TRT. What is the differential between, for example, what you would think is reasonable for TRT now versus like cruise back then? Was there thought to...
I didn't really think about it. It's 100 milligrams every other day of test. That would be a cruise for me. So it's 400 milligrams.
Okay, so it was like an actual... cruise versus like an HRT.
No, it wasn't an HRT.
Gotcha.
No. And I definitely didn't want to lose any muscle mass, any hard-earned mass, and particularly because I'm dieting down for a bodybuilding show. Now 2010 comes around, and I've got the world's strongest pro bodybuilder, and that one I wanted to step it up. I'm competing against Johnny Jackson. Of course, he couldn't do it because he qualified for the Olympian, so it was Ben White, and that was when I went up to gram of test, gram of EQ, gram of equipoise, or gram of deca. So I went up to that, same 25, then 50 D-ball. But on this one, my dumb ass decided to add, not super draw, but M draw. Is that the other one?
Hormone,
yeah, super draw was basically what it is, for the last 30 days. And I'd never been so miserable in my life. I got my blood test done 30 days out, and then I got on the super draw. And then 3 days after the Olympia World's Strongest Pro Bodybuilder, I got the blood test, and it was horrible. My liver enzymes, I think, were 190. They're pretty high, pretty high compared to what I'd never been up that high before. And I was just miserable, just generally speaking. I was exhausted all the time. 23 hours a day, I was just completely exhausted. The 1 hour I trained was euphoric. It was like everything was light, 200-pound dumbbells just cranking out reps, 500-pound incline presses and just cranking out reps, super strong. Then I would leave the gym and go sit down and eat. And by the time my food even arrived, I was just out of it. I was so exhausted. One eye was almost shut. I had somebody videotaping the prep for that at the time, and launched a DVD, Proving It, I think is what the name of it was at the time. I wasn't any stronger. I was 305 pounds, and I wore a single ply, an old Inzer single ply, and I still barely benched 620. I benched 606 in competition, just missed a 615, I think, with no suit on. I barely deadlifted 800, and I had deadlifted 800 in the gym many times prior to that, and I was in a single ply, which doesn't add a ton to deadlift, but it should add 30, 40 pounds, I would think. But at the World's Strongest Pro Bodybuilder in 2010, on those extreme doses, I wasn't any stronger. At 305 pounds than I was at 275 in competition, on considerably less, and certainly not the toxic compounds that I was using. Didn't learn my lesson, so a year later, I do a powerlifting meet. This was the one where I was shooting for that 2,300 total. A month out, I'm training with Dan Green. I squat 905 in Mark's gym. We got video of me and Dan Green squatting together. And I can't remember if it was that day or a different day. I also pulled over 800 for a double. And that was 30 days out. So my dumbass, I decided to take, in addition to the Gamma test, Gamma EQ, Gamma of DECA, and the last 30 days I would do 25 milligrams of D-ball for a week and then go to 50 for 3 weeks. Again, if I went up any higher, I'd totally lose my appetite. I decided to add a cc of 100 milligrams of Tren a day.
Ooh.
700 milligrams of Tren a week.
Sleep out the window.
Sleep gone.
Yeah.
Yep. I started having really bad night sweats and insomnia. I lost 7 pounds and missed my opener, my 903 opener squat. The 905 I hit a month prior was pretty easy. I thought I had 925, 930 in me. It went really fast. I felt really under control with it. And that was another lesson I've been learning when I talk about, more isn't always better. You confuse side effects with effects. It actually made me go backwards. And I guess the point of this whole story from telling people about my experience is that more isn't better. I wasn't any stronger. It was unnecessary. My blood work was horrific. And when I came back the following March and did that competition again, I did it without the Superdraw, without the Tren, 750 test, 750 DECA, 750 EQ, and the 25 and 50 milligrams of D-ball a day for the last 30 days. And I set the all-time world record at 2303 at the time, and it felt a lot better. Yeah,
I think what a lot of people overlook and couldn't be stressed highly enough is that even if on paper more drugs equates to higher muscle building potential, the ramification systemically of whatever other things it's doing could impact your ability to actually even just eat the nutrients necessary to support that growth. So even if you have the potential from all these additional drugs, it may put you in a state of toxicity and just compromised health, whereby you would never be able to achieve that potential anyways, because you're in just like a state of dysfunction to begin with.
I talked about this on a podcast recently. I said in the absence of sufficient calories,
because you could take all of the gear, and if you don't eat properly or train, like, it's not going to do much.
So people flipped out and they started saying, well, we've got these studies that show that people who don't even work out and take steroids, they build muscle. And what people don't understand is those studies prove my point. Those are overfeeding studies. Those are 170-pound individuals taking in 3,000 calories a day and 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Don't bother to read the methods. The methods is that was an overfeeding study. And those effects didn't occur at 200 milligrams. I don't think they occurred at 400. They occurred at 600 milligrams. So there was a dose dependent. And the gains were pretty slight. If you consider some of that's going to be water retention, you're talking about 2 to 4 pounds over the period that test was done.
Yeah, like there is some level of, obviously a man will be stronger than a woman in general. Yeah. And if you have a guy who happens to be 6 times more male than another male because of steroids, he'll probably have on average more strength and muscle than the other guy. But it certainly is not a justification for like not eating and training.
They work great if you're eating enough and training.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what prompted some people to say that people who don't even train take steroids and gain muscle. And it's like, well, they ate more food.
Yeah, and it's like contextually, who's going to take this stuff and subject yourself to this level of stress to just like sit there?
Yeah.
Hopefully no one.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, that's interesting, man. And like, there's often ambiguity and, just mystique around the whole like IFBB dosage situation.
Yeah.
You mentioned the kitchen sink approach. That's like, what do you see as common versus most egregious that you think is insane that people are doing?
Yeah, no, pretty common. I think that people use multiple compounds. As I mentioned in my pre-contest cycle, it was multiple compounds. Usually at a minimum of 1 gram a week to collectively, that'd be a pretty small dose for most pros. Closer to 2. I haven't really seen anything north of 3 personally, and I've worked with a lot of big athletes. I mean, the most shocking thing was listening to Chase Iron's cycle recently. Ooh, yeah. That's outrageous. And it goes to show you, and I like Chase. Chase is a nice guy. We go back some years, and he's used the vertical diet as well. It goes to show you genetics reign supreme because, there's a lot of guys out there using a lot less who are a lot bigger just because they're more genetically predispositioned than Chase, because he's used as much as anybody, and he's gotten, a lot of gains on that for him. Like you mentioned, at some point, if an individual hasn't made, like Phil Heath, came out of nowhere. His gains were so fast.
Yeah.
You just kind of know there's certain people who have that predisposition, and both are hyper responders.
Yeah, yeah.
And it may be androgen receptor affinity. I know we talk about that with injectable L-carnitine and potential of increasing androgen receptors, et cetera. There's things that people are doing to try and optimize that for that very reason, because I think that some folks are going to respond a lot better on that. Subsequent to my competing, and one of the reasons that I quit competing is because I had 2 kids, very, very young kids at the time, daughter and a son. They're 9 and 11 now. I dropped down almost immediately over 50 pounds. I got down to like 235. And I really haven't been over that. A couple of times I tried to gain a little bit of weight, and I would add in on top of my testosterone some Permabulking or some Anavar. I'm not able to gain the weight that I used to gain at my age, and nor recover the strength. I wasn't nearly as strong at 240 or 250 as I used to be at 275, 280. That was always the case throughout my career. It seemed like there was a threshold there that I had to exceed in order to get another level of strength. That was just my personal experience. But I thought it interesting that you talked about the creams, because at one point I was trying to get off of the injectable, because obviously I'm hypogonadal, so I need, as HRT, I'll be taking testosterone. And so I used the cream. I had the same experience as you. I felt fantastic for a while on the creams. I really enjoyed it. My testosterone never really exceeded 700, 750, right in there, my regular blood tests in terms of total testosterone at the time. But I started to experience some elevated DHT, and then subsequently some BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia. I started to see some incomplete evacuation, some increased sense of urgency, waking up frequently throughout the night. And of course, that was probably a good 7+ years ago. At the time, I'm like, I'm not old enough to have, prostate problems. So I got off of that and got on to 5 milligram tadalafil daily, and all the symptoms went away in very short order. And so I started watching my DHT better. I mentioned that on occasion I would add Permabulking and maybe Anavar under the tongue when I wanted to try and accomplish a particular weight goal. As recently as 2 years ago, when I was, CT Fletcher wanted me to come down and deadlift. And at the time I was probably only deadlifting 600, 635. Or so, probably 635, I think, because I went in the gym and I pulled a max and it was 635. And I'm like, I can't come down there, deadlifting 635. And then, so I added in some Primo and some Anavar, and over the course of the next 4 months, I would pull once a month, but I would use box squats with the Kabuki bar and camber bar good mornings as my accessories, as you were, to try and build those in order to increase my deadlift. If I pulled too heavy too often, I would just tank. I would just be too sore and I wouldn't recover, and my deadlift wouldn't go up. So I used these lower fatigue exercises. I was 54 at the time, right?
Yeah.
And I came in first pull 675 after 1 month later. 1 month later, 700. 1 month later, 725. So it's on my way. I was going to do a 750. And then December, the event is usually in January every year that CT throws. And then in December, I just crashed and burned. I bought a new house. I did some stupid deadlift for reps competition with Jake, the guy who was having coached me at the time. Did 600 for 5 and then 500 for 12, and then I got a cold for 2 weeks and crashed. Next thing you know, I could hardly pull 635. You know, just completely overreached, and was weak as shit and sick. And then I held that world's strongest, or no, that was at the Olympia. It was just an invitation for the rhino cage. At a 3,000 square foot rhino cage I set up, kind of like the animal cage at the Arnold. We set up a similar thing at the Olympia now. We just had one down in Orlando.
That's awesome.
And this year in Vegas we'll do the same thing, but we had some extraordinary lifters come and deadlift 700 for reps, and then this year we did 800 for reps. There were some savages lifting at that. But one of the things I found out, to go back to the story, is that the Permabulking would drop my estrogen significantly.
Oh, yeah.
Crashed my estrogen, well, down to like, I think it was 30 or 35 at the time.
That's probably why you didn't need a AI ever, too. I think you always said your estrogen was fine, even when you're using decent doses of test.
And that's a problem because you start to see APOB climb. You start to see your LDL climb if your estrogens go down. Estrogen helps with cholesterol clearance as well. And so it's more and more lessons that you learn in terms of managing people's biomarkers with their, some people HRT, some people performance enhancing drugs. But for the most part now, I'm just trying to stay as healthy as possible with the biomarkers and not concern myself with too much of the heavy stuff. Just do what I can to stay in shape. And people see me lift heavy stuff, but it's very infrequent. And it's usually only one top set. And it's usually, like for a long time there, it was box squats and the like, so that I don't accumulate a lot of fatigue. Same way I train my athletes. I worked with John Jones recently. We're getting ready to start Henry Cejudo's new camp, and Amir Albazi, the number 2 ranked UFC flyweight. And we do the same thing. We do exercises that don't accumulate a lot of fatigue for them, so they can spend all their energy in martial arts and not have a lot of DOMs affecting their training ability.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that, but first I do want to ask about, before we get off the drug discussion, growth hormone and insulin. How? Yeah, what have you ever tried it?
I played with growth hormone. I told you I took 2 IUs for pre-contest. I thought it was great for fat burning. It seemed to help me lose weight. There were a couple occasions throughout my career where I tried taking more, 6 IU, 8 IU, 10 IU. Never for any consistent extended period of time, but the first thing I saw was insulin resistance. And I got water retention and I got carpal tunnel. And so I would quickly jump off of it. And that would happen very quickly almost every time I tried it. I've had many athletes like that go on even sometimes as little as 2 or 4 IUs and start to, some people just respond differently. Next thing you know, their hands are going to sleep at night and the like. I started to see my HA1C climb, the fasted glucose climb.
What was your fasting insulin climbing as well in response to all that?
Because
one thing I do know that often goes overlooked is that growth hormone, its action is intent. The intent of it is to liberate into circulation and make you acutely insulin resistant. But it's like the chronic effect of that perpetually is bad, obviously. So I'm just wondering if that was something you noticed that was actually negatively impacting bodybuilding outcomes as a whole, because you were like perpetually in a state of insulin resistance more so.
Right. Yeah, I would see the fasted insulin will climb as well.
Okay.
Up to 14, 16, I think at the highest. I'd have to go back and look. It's a neat thing about those LabCorp records is I could go back 15 years and check and see every single blood test and the date I took it and all those results. But I never felt as though I'm a little impatient. I know that's kind of the kind of thing you want to take for a long period of time to see the results.
And hoping that it was from that and not something else, and you could never really know for sure.
There's the rub, is that when you're on 6-8 compounds, how do you know? So I never had a lot of that. I never had much luck. Tried a little bit of the insulin back in the mid 90s. It was the short acting post workout, and I would get hypo. and some scary episodes of that, when you start losing that peripheral vision, and and you start sweating, and you get shaky. And so I tried a Lantus, the long acting, later in my career in powerlifting back in 2012 and the like, and I just felt like I got fat. I was in surplus, but I never used it for bodybuilding. I always felt like it would prevent me from losing body fat. So I would use it sometimes to try and gain weight for powerlifting, but I just got really fat. The 2010 World's Strongest Pro Bodybuilder, when I got up to 305, and I was pretty heavy.
Now, I wouldn't ask you to disclose anybody's personal regimens, obviously, but just in general in these sports where you're pushing high body weights and need to push huge amounts of food and shuttle that food to where it needs to go, did you find that insulin use was useful for that, or was it more just making people fat?
Both, but in strength sports, that's kind of okay in the short term. If they couldn't get all the calories in, and because of the stress on the pancreas potentially from all of the food that you're eating, there might be some evidence that could actually be helpful. And so, 20, 30 IUs of Lantus was usually a good recommendation for some people. Some would, some wouldn't. Kind of depend on how they felt about insulin. Insulin's scary for some people. And, so.
And growth hormone for injury prevention, was that highly utilized compound as well?
Yeah, but the doses were never huge. I haven't worked with a client that's used high doses, like 10 IUs a day or anything like that. Because of my personal experience with the insulin resistance in the carpal tunnel, and I've seen other clients have similar experiences, 2 to 4 IUs would probably be it. And I think that recovery definitely improves. They have less DOMs with that. So maybe it's the combination of the GH and the insulin and the calories and all of that, but they tend to recover better.
Okay. And when it comes to, one thing I do want to talk about is because you're going to run tight on time here, your new iteration of the vertical diet. So it's constantly evolving based on what you are learning and all the newest cutting edge literature that you are assimilating into your own like consolidated framework of what is representative of like best evidence of practices. Are there any like major changes since inception that you could speak to as, I commonly believe this and it turns out X is what it turned out or what I believe now, and, common myths, bro lore, anything of that nature over the years?
Well, a lot of things. Some of it is female stuff, PCOS. Some of it is conditions like gout or acne that people experience and ways to combat that. And some of it is questions people ask about things like, the blue zones, or some of it is the hydration protocol that I've revised to optimize absorption of.
What's that look like now, out of curiosity?
Well, historically, I had kind of a flat recommendation as to taking 500 milligrams of sodium, but I didn't necessarily look at the concentration of water with that. And so, we would see some people, if they wouldn't get sufficient water with the sodium, then they wouldn't get the added benefit.
Oh, so some people were like tossing washing the salt.
Yeah, and that can cause, I said this in myosin seminar some many years ago, I said, look, it's not a more is better scenario, and if you take too much, you're going to end up on the toilet. Yeah,
if you drink like salt water from the sea, you will dehydrate yourself.
And what's interesting is my own training partner, he watched my video and took a whole bunch of sodium before the next workout, and ended up having he had to miss the workout. He had diarrhea. He had to stay home.
That's funny.
So, I'd be more cautious about being very specific about the recommendations. And there's been a lot of good research to come forth since then. And I've worked with Dr. Sandra Godick from the Heat Institute. She's a PhD in hydration and thermoregulation. Runs that Heat Institute. She does the sweat testing on the Philadelphia Eagles and a number of other professional teams. How she discovered that Lane Johnson sweats out 5 grams of sodium an hour.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then you got to create a protocol to help replace that, but the body won't be able to absorb that much. So you have to be, you have to work on that throughout the entire day, both leading up to, throughout, and post training. And so I go deeper into the protocol, what the concentrations are, what you should use pre and during, and then what you should use post. And that's something that I updated on there. I updated, as we talked about, the seed oils, and in terms of my former reference of poison to They do compete with omega-3 uptake with monounsaturated fats. And so if you want to get your omega-6, omega-3 ratio up, or, you guys have a test as well where you look at omega-3s, your omega, what do you call that, omega profile.
Yeah, I think it's omega status or something.
Yeah.
Which is useful because a lot of people blindly take doses of fish oil without knowing, is this the amount I need or is it helpful?
And I've always recommended they start with salmon if they can. And I've even done a video recently on how to cook it so it's not all fishy, because it could be a taste aversion.
Yeah.
I think they should get at least 2 or 3 servings of salmon a week, and then maybe use fish oil as a substitute or to augment that.
Yeah.
But I talk more about the importance of that. Ultra-processed foods. Reheated seed oils are toxic. We do have literature to show that those deep fat fryers of food do create inflammation, and that's also discussed by PhDs in nutrition like Joey Munoz, et cetera, have covered that topic. And I don't think anybody's surprised about that fact that you should probably stay away from the reheated oils, the deep fried foods. But we cover a lot of topics in there. Calcium to a greater degree. I do a lot more workouts for a whole sorts of different people that are interested. Dad bods and soccer moms, time efficient stuff.
One thing that should be mentioned is at the end of the book, you have like so many different example iterations of what you consider an optimal diet for gaining weight, losing weight, staying the same, different performance, contextual situations that would apply for each. Like, it's not just a book about why certain foods are good for you. Like, it has that information, but then it also has like practical examples of this is what Stan would endorse.
Sample diets from, I think, 1,250 calories up to 5,000. Yeah. I tried to put a lot of it in their grocery shopping list. And these are all things that people requested when I initially launched the first iteration.
Speaking of which, if you could give just at a high level, let's just say, I don't know, an average guy who's in the gym trying to gain muscle, 3,000 calorie maintenance with his activity factored in, like, what would a normal diet that you would suggest for, okay, you want to start gaining some muscle above and beyond that, just roughly what would that comprise of as far as like a full day?
Yeah, I'll start with a 300 calorie surplus, try and get a gram of protein per pound of body weight, or lean weight, depends on how, if they have a lot of excess body fat. And it could be 0.8 grams per pound. And I try and keep fats, so that's about 30% of total calories from protein, generally speaking. Trying to keep fats at around 30% as well. I think what the literature suggests is that anything under 60 grams a day of fats may compromise sleep and hormone production and fat-soluble vitamin transfer, et cetera. So that would be the lowest end, but 30% is a good number. And keep saturated fats under 10% of total calories, and the rest is carbohydrates to fuel workouts. But I qualify that by saying that the carbohydrates should start with a foundation of micronutrient-rich carbohydrates, potassium in particular, and that would be things like a daily potato, fruit, yogurt. You're going to get carbs from yogurt. The protein sources are an assortment of sources. I'd like to see people get some yogurt every day, or dairy if they tolerate the lactose. Red meat, lean red meat, iron, zinc, B vitamins, creatine, carnitine. Salmon at least twice a week, probably 3 times a week on the salmon.
Daily carrot still in there?
Daily carrot's still in there, yeah. The fiber, those are easy things to throw in with any meal. Just have a little baggie of carrots, fruit, obviously. I threw the almonds in there for magnesium, although we still supplement it because it's hard to get sufficient magnesium out of food.
Yeah, that was one of my questions earlier. Is that a supplement you take yourself?
That is a supplement I take. And I might have veered off when we were talking about Stu Phillips.
Just quick. What is a target magnesium that you think applies?
Probably 300 milligrams, 400 milligrams a day for most people would be sufficient. I know that.
I think the RDA is 400.
Yeah, and that would be I would supplement form. I would supplement 400 milligrams a day, and you probably get some from the food.
Gotcha.
Additional.
It's hard to get that through food.
It is, particularly because you have some of those. A lot of the high magnesium foods also have also bind to the magnesium, and so vegetables in particular. Vitamin D3, at least 2,000 I use. I think 4,000 is probably closer to what. And again, get your vitamin D25 hydroxy test. If you're deficient, you might need more than that, and it could take a number of months to bring that number up. That was my experience initially when I was having problems with vitamin D deficiency. And so those are the big ones. Omega-3s obviously could go in there. Creatine, I don't get a huge response from creatine because I eat plenty of red meat. But there seems to be other benefits than just strength, although the more recent hypertrophy evidence has gotten pretty weak in terms of long-term benefits. I mentioned this on Mark Bell's podcast like 10, 12 years ago, and people just went crazy. Creatine works. And I was like, well, it barely. And over the long term, not very exciting, but there might be some other benefits.
Neurologically, there seems to be, even though I think it's only like 5% of creatine stores in the brain, or something like that. But there's like a recent study, I think, in even elderly women taking 10 grams a day. And it's like huge on depression metrics.
Yeah. There's little downside. And other than some people get diarrhea from it. So you gotta be cautious of that. Those would be my big ones for supplements for most people. And I'm not, huge on supplements. If you're, if you're deficient if you're deficient in iron and don't eat red meat, then you probably want to get, maybe a liver supplement or something like that if you don't tolerate liver. And there's, a lot of vitamin A in the liver supplements as well. But I just don't have a long list, right out of the gate until I see what are you deficient in.
Is liver in the sample diets now?
I don't have it in there. No. I was just thinking that's a great way for women to get iron. As a supplement. If they're anemic.
Okay. So did we cover every food that would be in an example diet out of curiosity?
Pretty much. I think that the carbohydrates I mentioned, the high potassium carbohydrates, your fruits and vegetables in particular would be your foundation. And then, some soluble fibers, if it depends on how well you tolerate oatmeal. Overnight oats tend to be a little more digestible. Something like Coach's oats, which are ground real fine, maybe a little more digestible.
Not worried of the phytic acid?
No, once you cook it, it's gone. But this is where, the recommendations have to be contingent upon how individuals respond to the particular food. If they have digestive distress or what have you. So, and then, obviously we got the carrot in there for fiber. A really high fiber raspberries are extraordinarily high fiber fruit.
Is the iodine still?
It still is there, yeah. Iodized salt or cranberry juice to get just 3 ounces of cranberry juice is 300% of the daily RDA. 125 micrograms is the RDA, and that can be pretty important for thyroid support. And so that I know people oftentimes want to use, like I just saw a post the other day about pink Himalayan salt has all these minerals. There's not sufficient. It's negligible. It doesn't make a meaningful difference. Some people said the same thing about grass-finished beef. Having more omega-3s. It's like you'd have to eat 100 pounds of beef to get 1,000 milligrams of vitamin or of omega-3s. So you go to salmon because it's 200 times the amount of omega-3. So sometimes we'd be cautious about whether or not there's a physiologically effective dose. Just because it's in there doesn't mean that it's a sufficient amount to give you a performance benefit.
Yeah, one thing I would say as some context to the vertical diet. People probably have gathered by now if they've made it to this far in the podcast, but it is not just red meat and rice, which is like a very brutal misconception.
Yeah, I know you didn't read it if that's the case.
Yeah.
And a lot of my clients don't read it too. I send them the diet. I say, please read this.
I think Monster Mash is like all you eat essentially, but not the case.
Yeah. I have my clients send me their hours of sleep every morning, their body weight, and a picture of every meal. I think that's probably one of the, not even for my benefit, but for theirs in terms of compliance. And I get really good compliance.
Accountability, I can imagine.
100%. And it gives me an opportunity to just quickly glance at their day of food and see if there's something we can, improve. Hey, where's your dairy? Hey, where's your fiber? Hey, where's your, because they'll quickly people tend to quickly migrate towards what they what tastes the best and what's the most efficient for them. And it's like, well, we should try and, add this item or that item. So Chronometer is a good,
I love them.
Yeah. That's a good app that you can use, put all your food in it to see what you're deficient in. And I might use that to make a recommendation as to what vitamins or minerals that you should be supplementing or what foods you could add to help any deficiency.
Yeah, I just found out recently they're in like a very small town up north of me in Vancouver. Like they're up in Revelstoke, I think, and it's like the most obscure, not expected area for them to be. And I was like, oh wow, like local to me and cool people there. Yeah, great app too. One thing I do want to circle back to is you mentioned some of the new, some of the athletes you're working with, John Jones, Henry Cejudo recently.
Yeah, Mitchell Hooper.
In general, if you were to speak to some of the most high impact changes you've made to the protocols of some of these high performing athletes in MMA or in powerlifting, strongman, what have you. What do you think are some of like the lowest hanging fruit things you saw when you came in as, you know, we'll change this now and this will notably, markedly improve performance or recovery?
I like how you positioned that, lowest hanging fruit. Look, John Jones was a 14-time defending champion before I ever met him. You know, Hafþór Björnsson was already one of the strongest men in the world. Lane Johnson had already signed 3 $50 million contracts as one of the greatest offensive linemen in history before I ever met him. Brian Shaw, 4-time world's strongest man before I ever met him.
Yeah.
So I don't think that I'm the cornerstone to their success. I talk about the athletes I train more for the experience that I've gained from that.
Yeah.
I learn just as much as I teach in these interactions. So I call them collaborations. But I think you're right. The low-hanging fruit is what I find. I always think to myself, how can I help this guy? He's already the best in the world at what he does. And then when you get in there and ask a few questions, you find out that a lot of these people are successful in spite of themselves.
Have you seen DK Metcalf's diet?
No, I haven't.
Oh my
I'm
God,
afraid to.
dude. It is like 1 or 2 meals a day, and it's like a coffee, a bag of candy, and then his dinner is just whatever protein was made for him, and that's it.
I heard about that.
And he's one of the best players.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And there's a lot of coaches that'll tell you, it's my experience when I was a young trainer training the guys at the University of Oregon, they eat fast food most of the time. As long as they eat enough, these guys are at a whole nother level. So I'm not religious about, you know, the vertical diet necessarily. I understand that calories are king, proteins, you know, priority, and then just being able to consume it all.
It's a model, though, to take practical takeaways from, not necessarily to like myopically adhere to entirely, which I think is important.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to, again, meet your client where they're at.
Yep.
Probably the big thing would be the CPAP was number one. And it probably had helped them more in things like blood pressure, which they may or may not care about at the time. And they don't care about it. Maybe they just don't think about it at the time. But that's a big one. Hydration was another one, leading up to and throughout competition.
Specifically in MMA, though, or also in NFL?
Also in strongman,
strongman.
Just for training sessions. They tend to have more energy, more endurance, more stamina for some of these long training sessions, NFL in particular.
And is it actual fluid they're low on typically, or is it electrolytes in particular ratios, or both?
Both. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. John Jones sweats like crazy. I mentioned 5 grams an hour with Lane Johnson. So, and making sure that the protocol is correctly applied so that they're not getting too much water. You'll end up peeing it out. Too much salt, you'll end up increasing urination. Too much sugar, you'll end up increasing urination. These are things I experienced throughout my career and things that I've seen my athletes experience, which is why this has become so important for me to try and get this right.
Yep.
And it's genetically based. People's sweat rate, salt sweat rate, is individualistic, and so that's why we use Dr. Sandra Godek's patch test or sweat test to try and find out what kind of athlete we're dealing with. So that's a big one. I think after that, in terms of the nutrition, one of the biggest things is compliance. I talk about it all the time. I coined that term, compliance is the science, many years ago. Put it on Twitter so nobody would steal it from me. So it's time and date stamped.
Right.
But that's the big thing is how do I get these people to comply? I'm working with a couple of the wrestlers from the U.S. Women's Olympic Wrestling team right now. And one of their biggest challenges was compliance. I mean, I went down to Arizona and I gave them diets. I went to the store and I grocery shopped and I bought them what is that thing? A Ninja grill, to make it easier for them to cook their food and more convenient. I showed them, how to do the whole thing. Recently, when I was working with John Jones, Gordon Ryan, the jiu-jitsu legend, and
how's his gut health, by the way?
Yeah, he's doing much better.
Okay.
Yep, he came and stayed with me, and Phil Nurse, the legendary Muay Thai coach that coached George St. Pierre, those guys stayed with me, and I'll give these guys a diet. The first question I ask them is what do you weigh?
Yeah.
What do you want to weigh? And that's a very easy, equation then, because generally speaking, a lot of these athletes want to weigh more.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, what are you eating?
What's Gordon Ryan want to weigh?
Yeah.
Out of curiosity.
Well, he wants to be heavier. At the time, he was low 220s. I think he said he wanted to be 235. Okay. You might have noticed a recent picture of Gordon. He was looking really jacked.
Yeah.
When he and his wife stayed with me in Albuquerque when I was training John, that's one of the things we did. We worked on finding meals that he enjoyed, that he could eat a lot of, that were easy to cook fast and frequently.
And what were some of those? Because he is one of the most sensitive.
Yeah,
fats.
he's come a long way since, but of course it's more low FODMAP foods. Of course, it's sourdough toast and if we're doing bread, and then white rice if for carbs, and lean meats and salmon and eggs and stuff that's pretty easy to digest.
Yeah.
Quick meals, just ways for him to get calories in. The yogurt OJ shake is the one that they all love, and just 6-8 ounces of OJ with a cup of yogurt or 2/3 a cup of yogurt, and they'll slam one of those with every single meal, and that immediately puts a decent number of calories on top of their daily load just from drinking one, and it's easy to do. It tastes great. A little bit of ice cubes or ice water in there for your preferred consistency, and same with Phil Nurse. He wanted to put on weight too, and so I designed and cooked. I was actually cooking their meals most of the week. And kind of showed them how to do it. And there were a couple times at which, we had a very short time window, and I posted a picture on my Instagram of a 900 calorie meal. It was just that I could prepare in less than 3 minutes, and it's a sourdough toast with a little bit of strawberry jam on it. It's a bibigo rice bowl. It's a couple of hard boiled eggs, because we, keep them in the fridge already hard boiled. Costco's has those hard boiled eggs, and a yogurt OJ shake and a glass of milk. And we were damn near 900 calories. I think it was 55 grams of protein. Made it in 3 minutes, jammed it down, and we had to take off to practice. So it's just that kind of thing. Compliance is the science. And, even with the U.S. Women's Olympic wrestling team, Kennedy Blades is a young phenom that just came out of high school and has just taken the wrestling world by storm. I gave her the whole diet and planned it all out for her. And then I told her to take pictures of her meal, and she sends me the first meal is half a bagel and a Chobani yogurt, which obviously isn't what I obviously designed. And then at lunch, it was 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And not to pick on Kennedy, but that's common with a lot of the athletes, is that you'll give them this whole program, and then the reason I get them to take a picture every meal is because they're not adhering to it. So we had to try and figure out, how are we going to get her? She was underweight. She needed more calories. And she's not going to do it on a half a bagel and a Chobani for breakfast. She's just deficient in protein to begin with. And so in that case, we went to meal prep. And, I own a meal prep company. It's not a shill for a meal prep company. I don't care who you use, but it's just so convenient. Yeah. I've had the Vertical Diet meal prep company for going on 6 years now, and I ship meals all over the country to people's doors. And I order them, and I take them with me. And when I travel somewhere, I've got a bunch of frozen meals, and I'll cook a couple and put them into those hot thermos, and I'll take them on the airplane with me. And I've done over 200 seminars in 14 countries in all 50 states in the last 5 years. And I always have my meals with me. If I leave to Moscow or to Switzerland or to Australia, I'll take a rolling Coleman cooler with 30 meals in it, and I'll check it onto the plane. And when I land, I stay at a place with a kitchenette or a microwave and a fridge, and I've got my meals. And so I proposed that that's what the wrestling team should do, and they decided to do that. And more recently, Kennedy traveled overseas and didn't take her meals. And I've been warning about this for years. I used to see the strongmen do it when they'd go overseas to like Manila, and they'd eat the local food. Next thing you know, they've got Montezuma's revenge, and they're on the toilet with diarrhea, and they're losing 5, 6, 7 pounds, and they have a horrible performance. Sure enough, Kennedy traveled overseas. I don't know what it was, Azerbaijan or somewhere she went, and got food poisoning. And, she barely eked out a bronze medal, which is below her standard. She's just so extraordinary that she felt as though she could have won that if she hadn't been, otherwise had lost that weight. Yeah. And so some of those little things are pretty important. So I guess in generally speaking, with a lot of these athletes that I mentioned, just trying to make things easier on them. Yeah. A week into working with Brian Shaw, he called me up and he said, Stan, I'm hungry. I haven't been hungry in years. And that makes it easier on him, because people who haven't been through that, trying to maintain or gain weight, and how hard it is to consume enough calories in a day, and the impact that has on your digestion and on your stool quality, and you're just on the toilet half the day. In many cases, eating the pizza, pasta, pancakes, and the kinds of things that that they try and do just to keep their calories up. I designed the diet very differently so that stool quality is good. They're never bloated. The 10-minute walks help with that after meals, and the food being a low gas food, generally speaking, low FODMAP, lower gas food, so they don't feel all uncomfortable. and the food digests a little. It's easier to consume more of it faster. You digest it quicker. You can eat again sooner, and then rinse and repeat. And that's what I try and do with all the athletes that are trying to gain weight. And I think we were specifically talking about that group of people.
Okay. For one question on meat, so a lot of people will not have access necessarily to the best venison or grass-fed, what have you, bison. In general, like how much of a difference does it make in the grand scheme of things from a health markers or performance perspective when you have like the pinnacle of organic, grass-fed, et cetera, versus, I don't know, like whatever the best option is at Costco kind of thing?
It's going to piss some people off. It always does. There's really no meaningful difference. And many people a lot smarter than me in the nutrition industry.
Like, let's say we get a hard-boiled egg from Costco in like the package that's already peeled and ready to go versus whatever Paul would say is the best egg you can get kind of thing.
Yeah, it sounds like Paul. It's just no measurable, meaningful difference in terms of outcome or performance between organic and conventional. I think the bigger tragedy would be convincing a mom that she who can't afford organic vegetables, that somehow she can't feed her kid conventional vegetables because she thinks that they're poisonous because some scumbag advertising agency like the EWG with their Dirty Dozen has convinced her that somehow the fruits and vegetables at her grocery store are bad for her kid. I just think that's sad.
Yeah, what do you think of the Dirty Dozen? Because my mom even believes that.
It's complete nonsense. The EWG is a marketing arm for organic foods. Yeah, and this isn't just me saying this. This is RP Strength saying this. This is Examine.com saying this. This is Andy Does Healthy saying this. This is Food Science Babe saying this.
So organic is a total scam.
Organic is a total scam. There's no measurable difference between the health outcomes for organic versus conventional. Now, if you want to support your local farmer, I think that's great. That could be a reason why you might want to eat organic, but it fails on every other metric. I know people will start screaming and yelling about Monsanto, and organic uses chemicals too. And people don't realize that. And so, I mean, we could take a deep dive into that with, plenty of references and researches, but there's better people than me that have already covered that as in the names I just mentioned ad nauseum. And there's plenty of peer-reviewed published research to demonstrate over many years that in terms of health outcomes or performance outcomes, it's just not measurable. And we already kind of touched on grass-finished versus grain-finished beef. Probably the only difference there would be the fat content, in which case there may be you could just get a leaner cut if you were concerned about your APOB elevation from fatty meats. But in terms of the micronutrient quality, it's very little measurable difference. I mentioned the omega-3s are a little higher in a grass-finished, but again, not the place you'd go for those. Get your salmons, 200 times the omega-3s. I know people obsess over these kinds of things for other reasons, whether it be animal welfare, whether it be environmental. But in fact, the conventionally grown fruits and vegetables in particular use less land and yield more crop than organic, and so there would definitely be an argument that would be even more efficient for the environment. But people tend to have their deeply held beliefs, and they are offended anytime somebody suggests otherwise. But I've just got done saying that the best diet's the one you'll follow, and that the McDonald's diet with weight loss will get you just as much health benefit as any other diet, just simply by the weight loss itself. So I don't suspect anybody's going to be leaning on me for advice on organic versus conventional.
So when people are getting fruits and they're thinking, oh, there's chemicals all over this stuff, how would you... Like, do you just rinse it and that's clean to you?
It's certainly reasonable to rinse it. The big challenge is that the dose makes the poison. And that having a chemical on something doesn't necessarily make it poisonous to you as the consumer. And the FDA regulation of course now it's on the FDA. Now you get your tinfoil hat on, and the FDA's bad, and so everything's bad. And I'm not saying they're right about everything, but
sure,
they regulate both organic and conventional foods, and you find that the doses that are on edibles are measured very carefully, and the allowable amount of those chemicals are well within a tolerable range, and we just don't have any evidence that people are experiencing any adverse effects
Is there
from
any
eating
more
fruits and vegetables.
any more rigorous cleaning that you would take towards fruits to prepare them for ingestion, or just rinse and have at her?
Yeah, rinse and have at her. I think people, this is another one of those majoring in the minors thing. I mean, nobody's dying of cancer from foods that you buy at your grocery store, healthy fruits and vegetables. If anything, we're not eating enough of them.
What about frozen versus fresh?
Nothing wrong with that either, yeah.
Do you think their micronutrient density is
Just as good, yeah.
Okay.
Frozen, fresh, canned, those are all
good?
reasonable ways to consume fruits and vegetables.
You just saved a bunch of people a bunch of money.
Yeah, no kidding. And that's one of the considerations. One of the reasons I get so upset about people hyperventilating about organic or grass finished is it is more expensive, and not everybody can afford it. And to demonize it as being somehow unhealthy, it's just not the case.
Well, man, I appreciate everything you do, and I'm glad we finally got to meet up and connect and talk about some of this stuff. And I'm really looking forward to the next iteration of the vertical diet. I will continue to endorse it and tell people this is the go-to spot for learning about not only how to stay healthy, but get jacked at the same time. And I appreciate you.
Thank you. Vertical Diet 4.0, the new version, I should have up within the week, and that's all at stanefferding.com. There's a button there for my vertical meals. There's a button there for the ebook, and Instagram is at Stan Efferding, and then on YouTube I still have those rants, which are always fun. That's Stan Efferding on YouTube.
Awesome. So by the time this podcast comes out, it should be live, I would think. So target launch date is December, what, for the book?
For the ebook, I'll have it up by end of next week, December 15th at the latest.
Okay, so it might already be up, but either way, I'll have the link in my video description as I always do. And check out Marek Health for all your blood test needs and diagnostics. And follow Stan on all the socials, and talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, brother.